SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this SUERF ECB workshop on China and the shifting global order. Before we start, let me thank the members of the scientific committee for this workshop: Isabel Vansteenkiste, Alexander Al-Hashimi, Maria Grazia Attinasi, Taida Spital, Katrin Forster, Van Arsen, and Daniel Kapp, all from the ECB, for the very smooth and productive cooperation in preparing this workshop. My name is Ernest Gnan. I'm Secretary General of SUERF, and I'm very happy to hand over now to Isabel Vansteenkiste, formerly Director General for International Affairs at the ECB, and as of today, Counselor to the ECB President, Christine Lagarde. Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Ernest, and good afternoon to everybody. And let me also extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the ECB. It's a pleasure to join Ernest in opening today's workshop, and I would like in particular to thank SUERF for their collaboration in organizing this event. And also let me already now express my appreciation to the presenters and moderators who will be sharing their research and insights with us this afternoon. If you look at the theme of today's workshop, China and the shifting global trade order, it could not be more timely. We meet against the background of significant changes in the global economy, and understanding these shifts that are taking place and their implications are highly relevant not only for policymakers such as we at the ECB, but also financial institutions, businesses, academics. Now, if you look over the recent decades, we can see that China's role in the world economy has expanded considerably, and today it's not only a manufacturing powerhouse, but a key partner for many emerging markets through trade, investment lending, and often linked to major infrastructure projects. And China has also strengthened its position in the global supply chains, in particular in strategic sectors such as rare earths and advanced manufacturing. And of course, these developments just underline China's growing weight in the global economy and global debates, right? But of course, we've also seen some shifts that took place in China. For instance, it aims to reduce its vulnerabilities to external shocks by diversifying sources of imports. But at the same time, also, it continues to rely heavily on exports as a driver of growth and as a way to deal with domestic overcapacity. And in the background, of course, we see that global trade environment is going through significant realignment, and we have seen some resistance from China's main trading partners to the strong competition from the country's exports. And recent trade restrictions, including those we've seen earlier this year, are also prompting Chinese firms to seek new markets and adjust their global production strategies. Of course, these dynamics are reshaping global trade and are particularly relevant for Europe, looking at how trade opened Europe over this. And it raises important questions about the role of Europe in the world, the resilience and diversification of our supply chains, and the broader implications for not only our growth, but also inflation outlook. Also, there's a lot of topics that this workshop can here cover and discuss. Today, the focus is going to be on two sessions. One is going to be on China's global economic footprint and its evolution, and the second one on China and the global trade realignment. But for that, I very much look forward to today's keynote lecture and the rich discussion that will follow. And for that, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Linda Yue. She's an economist, writer, broadcaster, and currently serves as a fellow in economics at St. Edmund's Hall at Oxford University. And she's the adjunct professor for economics at London Business School. She has published widely on economic growth, development, globalization, and she's well known for her work connecting academic research and policy debates. So she's very perfectly suited for this workshop, and also for her broadcasting for the BBC, Bloomberg, and other media outlets. So we're very honored to have her here today with us and to deliver a keynote lecture on geoeconomics and economic growth in a changed world. And with this, I pass the floor on to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you to Ernest, and indeed, thank you to SUERF and for inviting me to just share some thoughts on this very topical question, as Isabel has said. It's always a pleasure to be able to hear research on, I think, very policy relevant issues. I'm looking forward to the rest of today as well. And I also want to applaud the ECB for in my time in academia, I can think back many years, the constant engagement with cutting-edge academic research is to be thoroughly applauded. So it's lovely to return. So what I hope to do is to take you through, I think, really three different ways of thinking about geopolitics intersecting with economics, so therefore geoeconomics, and that really goes to this change world concept. Then I want to talk about whether catch-up growth is still possible for China, so I will show you that slide in just a moment. And I also want to move to thinking about China's role in the new global trading order. With all such big questions, I'm going to conclude with some conclusions, but mostly more questions that further research would be very helpful to engage with. So I will leave a few minutes to hear your thoughts, your reflections towards the end of the session. So the session will end at 2:45 p.m. CET. So I will stop the presentation before that. So if you have any thoughts, please put it into the chat. The chat bubble is on your bottom right-hand side. And as Ernest says, it's like a cartoon. Click on the bubble, put in the chat, and we can all see it. So with that, let me move to starting with a quote, not by an economist, but this is attributed to the American writer Mark Twain, who reportedly said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." So if we want to talk about a changed world, I think we can take some lessons from history. So thinking back to a previous era of great powers in the interwar years, those were Austria-Hungary, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the US. And so you might recall during that time, the US and the UK formed an alliance against the Axis powers, so Germany, Italy, Japan. This period of intense competition all culminated in World War II. Post-World War II, there was a new global order dominated by the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. So I want to take a look at what that world looked like in terms of great power competition. So in this new age of great power competition, I will look at geoeconomics and not only geopolitics, catch-up growth, and China's emerging role. So before World War I, this is research that mapped shifts in global treaty alignment. So what you can see in the latter part of the 19th century, the UK and the US were the great powers. And then the shift in this period was from the UK to the US. And it's proxied by the US becoming the main treaty partner for basically the Americas, except for Canada, which remained and remains actually in the Commonwealth for the UK. So what does it look like today? So the shifts in global treaty alignment, the US versus China today, so really dating to from the 1990s, as you can see by this metric, China's main treaty partner now encompasses much of South America, the very bloc that switched to the US in the last shift of great powers, and large swathes of Africa, as well as the Middle East. So this era of great power competition, remember the Mark Twain quote, doesn't have to end the same way the previous era has. But there is, I think, lots of reasons why this is a changed world. There's a joke I make sometimes about how do you think about what great power competition encompasses. I'll just give you the joke version, which is if you ask Americans, the G1 sounds pretty good. If you ask China, the Chinese like to say, if you do business with them, it's a win-win, but that normally means that China wins twice. So this is exactly what this is about, which is it is fierce competition. And that backdrop, I think, leads to what geoeconomics, why this term has now become so prevalent, and what the world looks like when you have competition between the US and China on, remember, a number of dimensions, because this isn't just about trade, which we'll see, or investment, but it's called the era of great power competition by international relations scholars, because this is about shifts in power. So what does this world look like? Well, the very first one, I think very apropos to today's conference, is tariffs. So this looks back again to history, and you can see the average tariff on US imports is the highest since 1909. So this is obviously picking up the tariffs that were announced in April on Liberation Day. And I'll go through some of the changes since then, but I think the perspective from history seems very apropos given where we are today in terms of the use of tariffs. But undoubtedly, the tariffs are focused on China. So in this cut of the data, you can see that the world total for tariffs is the effective tariff rate, is the bunch of lines at the bottom, and the rate on China is many magnitudes higher. And in fact, the effective rate of tariffs on lots of countries, about 100 countries or so, is around 10%, which is higher than what it was before, but it's nothing like the tariffs that have been levied on China. And in fact, before the recent pause in tariffs, the additional tariff rates by both the US on Chinese exports and by China on US exports to China had escalated to essentially a level that the US Treasury Secretary described as equivalent to an embargo on trade. When you have tariffs at that level, it isn't, it's just not feasible to trade. So that has de-escalated, but obviously this is very much still ongoing. So why did some countries attract the ire of the United States more than others? It's the connector countries that were levied with double-digit tariffs. And this chart, I think, picks up the idea that it is still very much linked to China. So from this chart, you can see after the first set of Chinese tariffs imposed by the United States during the first administration of President Trump in 2018, it led to a decrease of exports from China to the US, so imports from China, but a increase, particularly from Asia. So this is global value chains at work, where countries like Vietnam became a connector country. And if you're a connector country, because multinational companies have deployed a China plus one strategy to try and move some production out of China, some of that was happening anyways because of obviously higher labor costs in China as it developed. But this chart shows you that the tariffs likely had an impact. So if you are a connector country, the previous surplus from China will be shifted to Vietnam. And this is why Vietnam was one of the countries that had experienced a very high tariff rate. Now, connector countries that run trade surpluses, therefore, were the subject of the tariffs from Liberation Day. And This is a chart that shows how much Mexico was also part of that trend, where the US import share from China, the black line dropped precipitously in 2018, but imports from Mexico continued to increase. And the challenge to global trade and global value chains isn't just from tariffs, but from questions that have been raised around rules of origin. So in other words, President Trump has said he doesn't want to see Chinese cars coming from Mexico. So Chinese car manufacturers have replied to say they're producing EVs for the Mexican market, and not to take advantage of the USMCA, which is the second version of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But if you start to question the source of capital, even if the production meets rules of origin criteria, so there's only de minimis input outside of Mexico, for instance, then I think you do start to wonder whether there is a structural shift in how global value chains, rules of origin, source of capital, and all of this, what this will look like in this new era. So a few other trends in terms of the global trading order. This is research by the World Bank, which shows that trade growth coming from emerging markets and developing economies, they've actually, it's now the case that they're actually exporting more goods to other emerging markets and developing economies than to advanced economies. And the growth of exports, by destination in the second chart shows you a similar trend. What we've also seen is FDI, foreign direct investment flows, have diverged. So this is what was described by the previous Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as friendshoring. So what you can see is west to east, FDI flows, the blue line, have dropped since 2018, and the amount of flows west to west and west to neutral have increased. So this, again, has implications for global value chains, given FDI is often the flip side of the coin, certainly very closely related to trade patterns. So another element of this world is the decline of multilateralism and the growth of traded services, which is less governed by international trade rules. GATS, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, has been recently updated. So there was a plurilateral push to create more rules around services, liberalization in trade, but it's still less governed by trade law than goods. And what you see is the number of trade agreements have declined in this century. It's hard to believe we're a quarter of a century into the century. So what you have, even though you have this decline in new trade agreements, there's still an increase, a fairly strong increase in growth in terms of services trade, outpacing goods trade. But again, less governed, and therefore, I think has scope to grow, because the tariffs that I've described are levied on goods. So there's also the increasing use of industrial policies. This is research by the EBRD, so it takes that region as a whole, and it plots China, which is the red line, which has really used a lot of industrial policies in terms of its own economy, but also, of course, in terms of its traded goods. And you certainly see that when you break it down to look at state subsidies. And China has a great deal of subsidies, which it uses to support either directly companies or by offering below market credit. And this purple block is just known as China-specific factors. So there's more forms of state support than you would find in other major economies, including another emerging market like Brazil. And of course, this has been one of the bases that the United States has been asserting there's unfair trade. So I want to move to thinking about impact on China's growth itself. So the IMF estimates that the impact on China is among the most severe. But if you look on this chart, Canada and Mexico are also pretty severely affected by US tariffs. So for a country like China, which is struggling to grow 5%, a knock to GDP of 1 to 1.5 percentage points, of course, is considerable. And I'll go through some of China's growth challenges in a moment. So this chart has, in fact, I saw this in a couple of ECB research papers. This chart is another way of cutting the data since the 2018 tariffs have come in. It picks up goods exports since the global financial crisis. And what you see is actually China has recovered and actually relied a great deal on export growth, even though it had before then, certainly during a period of greater rebalancing in the early part of the 21st century, started to significantly rebalance the economy towards domestic demand. But what this shows is certainly during after the pandemic, China has indeed focused on trade and export growth, and one of the areas which hasn't had as much export growth is actually the Euro area. The US has actually rebounded pretty well from the pandemic. So given that trend, China's trade surplus has soared, and partly the exports have increased a great deal since hitting a record last year, and its imports, which haven't really grown. And that's where the record trade surplus comes from. And that is a reflection of an economy in China which is struggling since the property crash. And indeed, if you look at China's GDP rebalancing that I was describing, the early rebalancing efforts have well, certainly from this chart, you can see that investment-led growth has become more important than consumption-led growth, which would not necessarily be the pattern that China had envisioned for itself, which is consistent with other emerging economies, which move from export-led growth in East Asia more towards being driven by domestic demand. So consumption has grown, but actually capital formation has grown faster. And relying on capital formation, the second chart shows you that China is much more reliant than other major economies, including India and Vietnam. So can China catch up in terms of growth? When if you slice the data a few ways here. So this is global ICT market share. This is an area where China is often viewed as holding some very impressive companies, including Tencent, which at one point with its Asia listing was actually larger, had a bigger market cap than Facebook before it became Meta. So it is impressive, but I think there is still they've caught up quite a bit, as you can see, since about 2012. That's only one cut, I should say, of the data. The second one is one that I think the picture hasn't changed a great deal, which is made in China, but with lots of Western parts. So, for instance, for this particular passenger jet, China produces the tail and it produces the wings. But the engines, the hydraulics, the fuel system, the fuel recorder, all of that is made largely by the US and also by some European companies as well. So catch-up growth, second cut of it suggests China is still not quite at the technology frontier. China's industrial robots, this is where China does lead the pack, and this picture gives you the density of how the robots are not just found on China's Gold Coast, which accounts for the bulk of its GDP growth, but actually across central parts of China as well. And China's unicorns. So China actually has fewer unicorns than the US, and recently has about the same as the rest of the world. Unicorns are private tech companies that have a valuation of $1 billion, and part of the shift in China over the past few years is that the capital, you see this in a future chart, is coming from the state and not from venture, which is a less efficient allocation. So I'll move on to China's cyclical challenges and some structural challenges as well. So the cyclical challenge I mentioned is China's property crash. So my latest book, The Great Crashes, Lessons from Global Meltdowns and How to Prevent Them, looked at the implications of a Chinese property crash. This just gives you the IMF's latest assessment of it, and you can see that new housing sales in cities continues to roughly decline or at least stagnate, and that has contributed to a serious drop in consumer confidence, which mirrors really the recognition that commercial property developers like Evergreen were really struggling. And this has, given the amount of wealth held by Chinese households in property, this unsurprisingly has had a negative wealth effect in terms of growth. But the challenge of where China is at in terms of its growth cycle is it's hard to separate cyclical issues and structural issues. So in other words, as China becomes an upper middle income country, certainly on the Gold Coast, how much of the slowdown is structural? How much of it is because of this property crash? Its structural challenges, as I've mentioned, is that it's still very investment-led. And as you can see from this chart that I was alluding to before, state-owned capital has outpaced private capital, which has been declining over the past few years. And this is not how China has grown since 1979, which was actually quite, lots of things to say about it, but it was quite market-oriented in terms of the private sector. And so this is a shift, and it looks like it is a structural shift. And this is the mirror to the rise in investment, which is chart 1, which is the decline of consumption as a share of GDP, which did pick up from the depths of the global financial crisis, but continues to be under 40%, which is below what it is for most major economies, which is between half to 2/3 of GDP, which means domestic demand as a driver, very reliant on investment rather than consumption, leading to overcapacity, leading to inefficient returns to capital, lots of structural issues that's probably impeding China's growth. And because this is, unsurprisingly, I have to talk, spend a moment on Chinese prices, given its monetary policy. China is going through another phase, another bout of deflation. China does go through cycles of deflation, but this particular cycle is probably worsened by deleveraging, not by households, but by property companies. Because remember, property companies and associated services accounted for 31% or so of GDP, according to research by Ken Rogoff and colleagues. And that deleveraging is very well known in terms of having a dampening effect on prices. And so this period of deflation is related to the property crash. But I put on PPI there because producer price index has dropped further, and this has a close relationship to Chinese export prices, and therefore the cost of Chinese exports into markets such as Europe, and that deflationary impact may well be what China is exporting as it copes with the current cyclical slowdown. So I'm going to finish with a few thoughts on China's role in the new global trade order, and then I'll turn to the questions that I can see have come in on the chat, which is appreciated. So I'm going to go through a few different dimensions of what China's role looks to be in this new changed world. So the very first one is China is a significant trading partner, as we know, for lots of countries, but it's actually overtaken the US as the largest trading partner for and you can see the numbers there, 72 countries versus the US's 40 countries. And the chart gives you the number of a number of countries where China, the light blue bar, is actually the largest trading partner. So even in countries where China is not the largest trading partner, it's pretty close in terms of share of total trade to the US. So this is related to the treaties that I showed before, China's relationships with countries around the world, not just emerging markets and developing economies, but actually with large swathes of countries. So this is a chart on critical mineral supply chains. So we know there has been some weaponization of trade. In other words, using economic tools to achieve non-economic ends. This actually was famously recently made clear by the US Federal Appeals Court, which ruled that President Trump's tariffs imposed under the 1977 legislation were not lawful. And in particular, the court mentioned that imposing tariffs to stop the trade of fentanyl wasn't justified by the delegation of power from Congress to the president. That's now going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, heard in November. But what it does pick up is the use of economic tools to achieve geo-economic aims. And critical minerals is a good example of this. If you look on extraction, rare earths, so these are the kinds of critical minerals that are essential to batteries, to electric vehicles, to smartphones. So China dominates the extraction of these, not necessarily because they don't exist in other places, but that China has actually undertaken the extraction of them, because there's pollution, there's other things to think about. But even more significantly, when you look at processing, China dominates the processing. So again, this does again come down to environmental concerns as to why some countries haven't done this. But it does mean that China dominates critical minerals, a large number of them, which it has used in the current trade war as leverage. Renminbi as a reserve currency, this is, I think, an interesting question. You can see the RMB there in pink. It has grown in terms of use pretty rapidly in recent years, especially because of the sanctions on Russia and moving away from the dollar due to that set of actions. But in terms of totality, the internationalization of the RMB hasn't really yet produced the kind of shift that one might have imagined over the past few decades. But China undoubtedly wants the RMB to play a greater role, but they would require reforms that are much more market-oriented in its financial system and other things. And of course, it's a restricted currency, but I think this is something which China will continue to focus on. China has decreased its treasury holdings. but it's moved mostly to shorter term holdings. And part of the reason the UK has increased is because the UK is the international financial center. So I don't think this may be as big a shift as it seems on the surface, but certainly treasury holdings is something, and the use of the dollar is related to this strategy around wanting to become a reserve currency. China's overseas lending. So in 2017 or so, China provided data on its overseas lending. The BIS data set is has generated lots of great research papers around where Chinese lending has gone. I'll just give you a couple of snapshots of it. This tells you how much China has lent to a lot of countries. And in fact, the BIS data shows China's lent to 175 out of 185 lending jurisdictions. May not be a major lender in advanced economies, but it certainly has reach in a number of places, as you can see. China is the world's biggest official lender. That's debt owed to China, more than the IMF, the Paris Club of 22 rich countries, and the World Bank. So what is the implication of this? One implication is that this is Chinese lending versus World Bank lending. The World Bank lends a lot more to social projects, as well as direct budgetary support in some instances, so government. China lends more to transport, telecoms, power, agriculture. So there's lots of issues around this lending in terms of commercial rates, in terms of conditionality, but just the sectoral split, I think, tells you that China's influence in a number of these countries and its aid is also important to note. So I think those are some of the aspects of China's role in the new changed order. And as I said at the beginning, my conclusions are mostly questions. So trade and investment corridors have been altered. The question here is for how long? And the research question here is, what are the structural determinants of trade and investment as we move towards trades and services, which is, of course, the invisible trade, and the growth of digitalization, which is the growth of the intangible economy. Second set of conclusions and questions is around geoeconomics. It will hinder China's catching up, but it has accelerated self-reliance. So will it work to overcome the middle income country trap, which is when countries stall when they reach upper middle income status? China no longer refers to the middle income country trap very much in its own policy goals, but this was a stated goal in the China 2030 report done by the World Bank back in 2012 that I had contributed to. I think that question, it's probably more pertinent today than even back then. And finally, China will seek to become a bigger player in this new trade order, but will its slowing growth hamper some of its ambitions? So I've left a few minutes for questions. So let me pick these up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please do feel free to pop it into the chat. True Chinese exports to the US via Vietnam. Indeed. I think when you look through the China Plus One strategy, as in map global value chains, that's exactly the shift. Trade from China has just entered the US via Vietnam, via Mexico, rather than dropped. So that's spot on. And, oh, there we go. Somebody actually answered the question. Somebody could help answer the question. Very, very good audience. I love it when they pose a question and someone else answers it. Are we at peak China? Yes, so the decompositions of Chinese growth roughly suggest that declining population, so yes, it's declining, working age population is declining. That will be a reason why China's growth has already struggled to grow at 5%, which makes it very hard to overcome the middle-income country trap, because the average growth rate for emerging markets, certainly before the GFC, was around 5%, and most of those countries are not high-income countries. And that and slowing TFP growth are the two biggest drivers, I think, in terms of China's growth rate being forecast to slow. Export deflation. They could redirect exports from the US to the EU given tariffs. So I think the answer there is yes. I think China continues to have overcapacity, so I think it will find other markets. The removal of tariff exemptions on de minimis goods, so this is very low levels of exports. I think the UK, for instance, is looking at mirroring the US policy so that they are not going to take goods produced from China that would come into this market instead. Obviously, if it does come in, it is deflationary, but it could displace, could be disruptive. So I do think that is certainly to watch for. Property market decline relating to the wealth effect of declining exports. That's an interesting question. I think that's really actually one for further research, because the export sector in China, so again, there's been a burst of exports over the last few years, but net trade hasn't actually contributed to growth of TFP for years until about the pandemic, when there was a real push. So it's not, China was somewhat rebalancing. So I think the property market decline, roughly speaking, is more of a domestic story, but again, I think that's empirical. Trade war and the elevated trade uncertainty is more of an outlier, only applicable to this Trump administration. Will it remain? Oh, thanks very much. It's very kind. Well, that was the research question, I close, which is this structural? So the joke about economic forecasting told by the great economist J.K. Galbraith. The sole function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable, which, by the way, we all have to do it. So anyways, all I'm going to say is almost certainly whatever I say is probably just a stab. The Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much, but they do agree on China. And this is why I think when this is described as an era of great power competition, if you look at the level of tariffs under the Biden administration, he maintained what it was under Trump 1. So I think trade fragmentation may outlast this administration because there's bipartisan support. But what I think hopefully will ameliorate is the challenge to global value chains around things like rules of origin that I described. The adherence to international trade law and multilateralism, I think, is still evident in the US, but not for the next few years. So I think there will be a structural change in trade because of the state subsidies, this what I outlined as really competition, trying to find a level playing field, perceptions of fairness. But I think some of the challenge to the legal and institutional foundations of trade and multilateralism, I think that is particular to this administration. But this administration is now in its second round. So we'll see. And then finally, how big should China's growth rate be to overcome the middle-income country trap? It's a really good question. So I mentioned there, before the GFC, the average growth rate of emerging markets was roughly around 5%. So China for years attempted to grow at least 5% in hopes of overcoming the middle-income country trap. There's a series of liberalizations and reforms in our World Bank 2012 report that I'd recommend if people are interested in reading about how that could decompose. But I think growing at 4%, sub 4%, I think they will really struggle to get the bulk of the population into high income status. I think there's a reason why it doesn't get mentioned as much anymore. So with that, there's one more that just snuck in. High youth unemployment, automation, Oh, that is a really good question. The reason why they've done a lot of fiscal stimulus recently is to address high youth unemployment. And I think this question about whether AI, what's going to do to the labor market, I think that is definitely a research question for someone to tackle. So with that, I'm going to conclude and really thank you for the fantastic questions and comments on the chat. I really appreciate it. And I think we are bang on time, Ernest.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Linda, for this excellent presentation. Really, there were so many thoughts in there. And as you say, it will trigger a new research agenda. Thank you so much for your time. And with this, I'm happy to lead over to Maria Grazia Attinasi, a senior team lead economist from the European Central Bank, who will moderate session 1.
Thanks a lot, Ernest, and good afternoon, everyone. So we start with the first session, whose title is China's Evolving Global Economic Footprint. So this is a rather broad session, which looks at how China's footprint in the global economy is shaped not only by trade, but also by industrial, financial, and political strategies. So we have three very interesting contributions, which look at the topic from 3 different angles. So without further ado, I give the floor to the first presenter, who is Harald Fadinger from the University of Vienna. So Harald, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. So this paper is called Trade and Industrial Policy and Supply Chain, Directed Technological Change in Rare Earths. And it's joint work with Laura Alfaro, who is at Harvard Business School, Jan Schimmick from Mannheim, and Gita Virananda from NYU. So the question we are interested in is, of course, the renewed effect or the renewed interest in trade and industrial policy, in particular in strategic sectors, such as those related to the green transformation, so batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, which are very much dependent on some critical mineral inputs, in particular rare earth elements. And we have already heard in the previous presentation that China has a very dominant market share, both in the mining, but also in the refining of rare earth inputs. And we are trying to understand how China's industrial policy in rare earth played out in a context where sectors are related to each other via global value chains, so that production actually spans different countries. And at the same time, technological progress in these sectors, if you think of batteries, electric vehicles, is very fast. So it is very difficult to predict what the actual impact of industrial policy is going to be. And in particular, in this paper, we answer the question what the impact of trade and industrial policy in these critical resource inputs is on the downstream sectors in terms of the production, but also the welfare effects of restricting the availability of critical minerals, such as rare earth inputs via export restrictions. So what we're going to do in this paper is different things. First of all, we provide a measurement contribution. So we construct a very detailed input-output table that actually includes the users of rare earth elements. So which sectors are the ones that are direct and indirect users of rare earth element inputs. This is usually not available in standard input-output tables. And second, we are also going to look at innovation in the downstream using sectors. So those basically that are important users of rare earth element inputs, such as the battery sector or the wind turbine sector, and so on. And we look at innovation in these downstream sectors. And we are going to look at how these downstream sectors responded to a historical policy event, namely China's 2010 rare earth export policy restrictions, which were a negative global supply shock on the availability of rare earth, and how innovation, productivity, and exports of the downstream sectors outside of China responded to the reduced availability and higher price of rare earth elements. And in fact, we find, maybe surprisingly, that the most dependent sectors actually expanded outside of China in response to this reduced availability of rare earth elements. And we have a particular mechanism in mind, namely a very strong technological response. We call it a directed technological response, away from dependence of rare earth inputs. So basically, we are building a quantitative economic model that has a realistic trade structure, input-output linkages, but also features directed technological change, where an input that has a very low substitutability, such as rare earth elements, are hard to substitute with something else. If the price of such an input strongly increases, then this creates huge incentives for firms to invent stuff that basically reduces the requirements of rare earth element inputs and to substitute them maybe with some other materials. And we're going also to calibrate the model to assess the impact of China's rare earth export restrictions in such an environment with directed technology responses. Let me quickly tell you something about rare earth. So these are like 17 elements that are not rare in the geological sense, but they are key inputs into sectors related to the green transformation, such as electric vehicles, electric motors, turbines. But they also have important medical and military applications, for example, for scanners, radars, and so on. They're also used because of their specific properties as catalysts to increase energy efficiency. So even though basically usually downstream products require small quantities of them, it's very hard to substitute them with something else. And the market structure of this sector is quite peculiar. Namely, China is basically a monopolist in mining and in particular in refining of these rare earth elements. This is not because they are available only in China, but it is because they're very dirty and environmentally hazardous. And also China has for many decades consciously subsidized this sector and driven out competing mines from the global markets. So that it takes many years to reopen mines, and supply therefore of rare earth elements is quite inelastic in the short run. And this gives China really a lot of leverage on the supply side of this sector. We do, however, find that, as we said, the Chinese export restrictions, as I will tell you in a minute, that try to reduce the availability and hamper basically downstream sectors abroad to promote downstream sectors in China, inadvertently triggered a very, very strong technology response abroad, so that actually we see an increase in innovation, productivity, and output of downstream sectors abroad in response to China's 2010 rare earth export restrictions. Let me also tell you a little bit more about these rare earth export restrictions. So as I said already in the early 2000s, China emerged as the dominant player in rare earth mining. As I said, this was a conscious policy. So Deng Xiaoping can be cited with the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. So China was making strategic use of this availability. In 2009, China's global market share in rare earth element production reached actually 98%. So that was the peak. In 2010, China reduced basically exports. So it reduced the quota limits for exports by 70%. And in the same year, there was also a diplomatic dispute with Japan, in response to which China suspended all exports of rare earth elements to Japan. And then there were some further restrictions happening in 2011. And these restrictions were basically in place until 2015, when the World Trade Organization deemed these export restrictions illegal. And then China lifted these export restrictions. So this shock lasted for around 5 years. And here you see what happened to the prices of individual elements on a log scale. You see a very steep increase in prices starting in 2010 with the export quota reduction. And prices, well, started to slowly decline and came back to the initial level, so even lower after 2015, when export restrictions were lifted. So this here is on a log scale, so the actual price increases were by a factor of 10
5 minutes are
to
left.
45. Okay, so what we do, as I said, is that we build a very detailed input-output table, including rare earth elements. I don't have time to go into the details, but here you can see which ones are the sectors that are most reliant on rare earth, in particular battery production, relays, industrial controls, turbines. And these using sectors also have a different mix of elements that they use. So we are actually going to look at outcomes of downstream sectors, in particular patents, so innovation, productivity, but also exports. We use a large language model to classify patents. So we basically read all the patents and let the large language model tell us whether this patent is something that substitutes for rare earth inputs or increases the efficiency of rare earth element use. And in the lower panel, you can basically see that there was a lot of response of patenting, in particular in battery and catalyst sectors, in response to, after 2010, in response to these rare earth export restrictions. We also do this in a more structured or sophisticated way by basically running a diff and diff with a continuous treatment intensity, where how much a downstream sector is treated depends basically by the total requirements of the downstream sector that comes from the input-output table of each element, times a measure of how easy or hard the element is to substitute with something else, which comes from engineering studies. So sectors most exposed to the Chinese export restrictions are those that use a lot of rare earth elements as inputs, that are also very hard to substitute. And when we look at the effect on patenting of the most exposed industries to the Chinese export restrictions, then we find that patenting increased outside of China, but not in China in response to this policy shock. So in the US, Europe, and Japan, a lot of patents that are specifically substituting for rare earth or increasing their efficiency of rare earth inputs happened in response to the shock. So there was a strong technological response. We also see a strong response in total factor productivity in downstream sectors outside of China that we don't see in China. And we also see a strong
2
response
minutes
of
left.
the exports. We are very strict on the timing. So also exports of the downstream sectors outside of China expanded. We also, to rationalize this, built a structural trade model that incorporates basically endogenous technological change. So basically, sectors are tradable and they're produced with intermediate inputs and a combination of labor and rare earth. Labor and rare earth are hard to substitute, so complementary. And as I told you, if there's an increase in the price of a hard to substitute input, then this is going to trigger innovation because it makes it very profitable to invent stuff that reduces the input requirements. So this is Ashimoglow's model of directed technological change, married with a model of quantitative trade. I guess 0 minutes. So we calibrate this model and we simulate the response of the Chinese export tax on rare earth inputs. And we compare this in a model that has exogenous technologies and one where technology endogenously responds. And here I show you the impact of real GDP of Europe, Japan, the rest of the world, the US and China. The blue model, the blue bar is the model with exogenous technology. So this would be a standard quantitative trade model. The red, sorry, is the one with endogenous technologies. The red one is the one with exogenous technologies. Chinese export restrictions of rare earth elements have a large negative effect on GDP of around 0.5 percentage point in the absence of an endogenous technology response. But in the model where technology responds endogenously to the price increase, most basically of the negative effects for the rest of the world go away. And the benefits of this policy for China are also much smaller. And similar things we could say about welfare. So they're basically all the negative welfare effects are compensated by the endogenous technology response. So in conclusion, in this paper, we have studied China's 2010 industrial policy regarding rare earth element exports restrictions. Surprisingly, this shock was expansionary in the most dependent sectors abroad. And the challenge is that this negative supply shock of rare earth elements triggered very strong technological response, directed technological change away from the usage of rare earth. So to a large extent, basically, the shock was cushioned by this endogenous technology response. And I finish my presentation here in order not to go too much over time.
Thanks a lot, Harald, for this very insightful paper. We have a few questions in the chat from Ernest. Maybe we can also go live with the questions because maybe reading takes longer than...
Looking back at the demise of the European PV elements and wind turbine industry, what was rare earth scarcity and price a key driver, or was this more due to general cost advantage of China? How do you see this for electric vehicles and batteries now? Yeah, so I guess there are, of course, many more policies, right, that China did to promote its electric vehicle and battery sector other than export restrictions on rare earth elements. So I think these other effects were dominating the ones related to export restrictions on rare earth elements. But the hard availability, basically, of these key inputs for foreign firms actually triggered that strong technological response, right? It is very different. So actually, if you were to restrict the availability of batteries for European producers, I'm pretty sure that that would trigger a very strong innovation response, right, in the battery sector in Europe. So if there is an input whose tradability you restrict, that is key for your production that will trigger a very strong technological response domestically. And I think this is also the kind of what we can learn with the external validity kind of from this policy experiment, right? If you were to restrict, let's say, imports of electric vehicles, so the final product, this is not going to trigger a strong response of technology in Europe of the battery sector, because the batteries will continue to be imported from China, right? So if you want to promote the European battery sector, you need to restrict the imports of batteries, clearly. I'm not saying that this is an optimal policy, because clearly this will have large welfare effects for European consumers and producers as well. I'm just saying it's going to trigger a lot of innovation in the battery sector in Europe.
Okay, thanks a lot. Is there any other question? Meanwhile, maybe I can also ask a question. I mean, I think your paper is very timely, because I mean, nowadays we are also seeing increased use of these limitations to exports, not only from China but also from the US, and they seem to be really, I mean, this weaponization of critical products or technologies that was also mentioned earlier is a very prominent feature of what we are seeing today. But so, in light of your results, could we conclude that perhaps this type of restrictions have a silver lining in the sense of accelerating technological progress in areas that would otherwise have taken longer to materialize? So do we
exactly.
see?
So this is what we see actually, right? That China is now catching up in high-tech chips, because it suddenly becomes very profitable to produce them in China rather than importing them from the US. So actually, the US policy might be backfiring, because they might actually be promoting exactly what they're trying to avoid.
And how do you see Europe placed in this type of? Can Europe also hope for the same forward leap in a sense, or the conditions are very different?
Well, I guess, as I said, if you have an input that is very hard to substitute, and you want to promote for whatever reasons, maybe because of geopolitical reasons, want to reduce your dependence on China, then of course restricting the importability of that input would be the best possible policy, let's say it, maybe not the best, of promoting that sector domestically, right?
Yeah, okay. So
so at the moment we're restricting the imports of Chinese final products, namely electric vehicles, but this is not maybe the smartest way of building a European supply chain, right? Because the supply chain will still be dominated by China.
And like you said, I think the broader implication is that these strategies actually that are devised to hurt the competitors may actually have the opposite effect, no? So in the sense that they push the affected countries to advance even more. So I think it's a clear example of the limitation of the strategies as a geopolitical weapon. So let's hope that the various politicians in charge will take notice. And
yes, I mean, it seems actually that the Trump administration has also changed its stance on these high-tech chip exports, right? So
also in exchange for the rare earths, so I think is really
exactly. So that actually is a policy that by the US, maybe they have realized that actually restricting the availability to China too much could provide too many incentives for China to invest a lot in these high-tech themselves.
Yeah. Okay, we have still a couple of minutes for more questions. Otherwise, we are just perfectly on time with the schedule. So, yeah, so thanks a lot, Harald. And then we can move to the next paper presented by Catherine Casanova from the Swiss National Bank on Chinese bank and their EMDE borrowers have the relationship changed in times of geoeconomic fragmentation? So Catherine, you can start sharing your slides if you...
Okay, sorry, I thought I sent them to you. Are you going to share them or I can also share one.
Yes,
Dragana will do it. Dragana will do it for you.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes from now. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present this paper. This is joint work with Joachim Cerutti from the IMF and Svopan Kumapratan from the BIS, who's a former colleague of mine. I'm not at the Swiss National Bank, but I was at the BIS before. We are using BIS data, but the usual disclaimer applies. So these are our views and they should not be associated with our affiliated central banks, let's say, or the IMF. So just the question that we are looking at here is, how does Chinese banks cross-border lending evolve after the pandemic? And just to give you the background, so we had a paper on China's lending and China's expansion before the pandemic, and it seemed like ever growing. And in the descriptive part that I'll show you, we observed that apparently the pace is slowing down. So here we are focusing on the lending patterns against the changes that have happened, in particular increasing geoeconomic fragmentation. We look at Chinese foreign policies because they could have an impact on China's banks' lending. And we look at borrower characteristics. So you have China on the one side, and then you have the borrowing countries on the other side. And we look at certain characteristics like indebtedness or how corrupt the country is to be perceived as characteristics of the borrowers. As I said, we look at the period from 2017 to 2022, or better said, we compare pre and post-COVID. In total, we look at about 86 emerging borrower countries. And we focus on China, but we try to compare it to the behavior of other parent banks, so other bank nationalities, like from advanced economies, like US banks or French banks, but also we compare Chinese banks with other emerging market banks. And our contribution here is exactly this, because we can actually compare market shares, which means that if everybody is expanding, we can contrast China's banks' behavior and those of other bank nationalities. And as I said, borrower risk and foreign policies, you'll see in our regressions how that plays out, but basically we have two sides of the lending relationships. What we find is, first of all, yes, there is this slowing expansion, but that happens against changing patterns in terms of correlations. So in our regression analysis, basically we look at correlation patterns of lending on the one side, and then on the other side there's trade, but there's also FDI or other bilateral economic ties. We find a change in this pattern, but we also find some factors which are reinforcing them. And the one driver which really stands out is the Belt and Road Initiative. So whether or not the borrower country is actually participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. We do not find such a reinforcing effect from swap lines that the PBOC, so China's central bank, has with other central banks, or the connector countries that actually Linda presented earlier. Not only the connector countries, but also the data. There are a lot of parallels actually to her presentation here. And finally, we also see some differences in the risk perceptions. I'll give more details later. So maybe on the next slide, we could have a look at the background. So just very short, the Chinese banking system is huge, not only in terms of its domestic growth, but also in terms of its global expansion. 4 out of the 29 G-SIBs are Chinese, and China is the most important lender to many emerging markets. Basically, 60 out of 140 emerging markets that are in this data set from the BIS. But still, there is this slowdown, but there's also some heterogeneity, and this is exactly what we are trying to explore. But the graphs here, it's just an illustration that this real very strong expansion that we saw before 2020 seems to slow down. On the next slides, you can then see the average borrower characteristics. So this is purely descriptive here. Basically, what we do is we use the outstanding amounts of lending to create an artificial typical borrower. We just use the weights basically. So this average or artificial borrower, which is based on data by outstanding amounts, shows that the typical borrower from Chinese banks is, first of all, more likely to be a commodity exporter. The perception of corruption for this borrower country is higher, and it seems like this borrower country is less creditworthy or riskier based on metrics which are commonly used in the literature. So for instance, in terms of the sovereign rating. In the graph, what you can see here, there are these there are always 3 dots in each panel. So for each borrower characteristic, blue is like all the other parent banks, like could be it's a weighted average of US banks, of German banks, of other banks from emerging markets. So the entire banking population, which is in this data set. And the blue and the red dot, these are the differences. First of all, when we look at all borrowers from Chinese banks, so in our empirical analysis, we only study 86 because this is where we have full data on, also for like other characteristics. That's the blue dot, and the red dot, these are the countries out of the 86, namely these are 35, where China is the most important lender. So you can always see that the patterns are more pronounced for most dependent borrower countries. And that suggests overall that there could be a different perception of risks that Chinese banks have from their borrowers relative to other banks, namely the black dots. On the next slide, you can see that it's actually important to use this data set and not any other data set, because the way we can look at this is from a very comprehensive point of view, which means we do not only take the lending into account which goes from the headquarters, taking here the example of Chinese banks lending to Egypt. There is this cross-border, the green arrow, which goes from China directly to Egypt. That's headquarter lending. But we can also add all the affiliates of Chinese banks in other reporting countries, namely affiliates located in the US, but they could also be in Europe or even in Australia. So that's what we call proceeding by bank nationality. So basically you have, as a bank, you have a passport, you have a nationality, and we attribute all the lending which does come from other countries to the respective parent country, which is China. That's important because on the next slide you can see that in a previous study we looked at the relative shares in lending which goes through offices that are not the headquarters. And it turns out that for banks from emerging markets, so Chinese banks in particular, but also, for instance, banks from Brazil or Mexico, on average, the share which comes from the headquarters to borrowers in other emerging markets is just 1/3. There's another third which goes through offshore centers, and the rest goes mostly through offices in advanced economies, like, for instance, London, which is a hub. But the message here is really that you would miss a lot of the lending if you just take the lending which comes from the headquarter offices. So the statistics which just actually are based on residents, they miss 2/3 of the entire lending. That's why proceeding by bank nationality is key here. On the next slide, there is some of the related literature, but I think for the sake of time, I'll skip it. There are some very important papers also by Christoph Drebasch and co-authors and Carmen Reinhardt. They mostly look at individual contracts, and this is a nice complement to our research, which actually takes an aggregate picture into account. Right, so now we can proceed to the empirical analysis, which comes in two parts. First of all, we use the entire data set that we have to compare China with other bank nationalities. And then in the second part, we look at China only, because only in that smaller data set we can add China's foreign policies, and we can analyze those. So on the next slide, you can see the empirical approach. It looks very technical, but it's basically a gravity equation. On the left-hand side, we've
5 minutes left.
5 minutes. Okay. On the left-hand side, we use either the total outstanding amounts of lending by a specific bank nationality like China, or we use the market share, as I said. On the right-hand side, we use typical gravity variables like distance, but then we also look at these other economic ties, for instance, trade or FDI, and some other borrower characteristics. In this first step, as I said, we take all bank nationalities into account, but to flag Chinese banks, we interact all the variables that I just introduced with an indicator of whether or not these are Chinese banks. And on the next slide, you can see the results for outstanding loans. So these are total amounts. In the upper panel, there are, it's like our, not a control group, but it's our baseline population of other banks. And in the bottom panel, which is highlighted, you can see the interaction effects. Basically, the message here is, yes, there was this very strong relationship of bilateral lending and trade that applies to all bank nationalities, but it was super pronounced in the period before COVID for Chinese banks. So to countries where there's a lot of trade that China has with the specific borrower countries, Chinese banks' lending was also very high. That changed after the pandemic. So then the interaction effect turns actually insignificant, and the FDI interaction turns significant and positive. So this means there's a change in these correlation patterns away from bank lending and trade to bank lending and FDI. We can go to the next slide, which uses market shares, just to contrast it with the outstanding amounts. Same pattern here. There's the correlation, even with market shares, is less with trade and more with FDI after the pandemic in the period that we're looking at. And sorry, I did not really explain the table to you. So we have different columns here. In the first panel, there's we look at different debt burden measures. The first one is external public debt over GDP as a proxy, and the other one is public debt over debt service revenues. And then we contrast, first of all, we always show the full period, and then we split it into pre and post-COVID. But bottom line here, there is this shift from trade to FDI in the correlation patterns. What's also there, and this did not really change, is that there is a negative correlation of bank lending and portfolio investment. Why is that? Well, it could be that this is because of the capital controls which are in place for China. That means that there is this negative relationship, and that did not change significantly before and after the pandemic. Otherwise, As mentioned before, we look at different borrower characteristics. So we have an index of perceived corruption of a borrower country, and this turns out to be very positive here. And also there's this there's an indicator for whether or not the borrower is a commodity exporter. That's also positive. On the next slide, we now turn to the empirical approach where we only focus on Chinese banks. So the sample now looks at outcomes of lending only for Chinese banks. We basically focus on market shares here to still be able to compare Chinese banks with the behavior of that of other banks. The reason why we do this is we want to look at policy variables, which we could not use for other countries because they just don't exist, like the Belt and Road Initiative or swap lines or other economic indicators of geoeconomic fragmentation. Otherwise, same setup, a basic gravity approach with gravity variables like distance and these bilateral economic ties on the right-hand side and some borrower characteristics. On the next slide, you can see the results. So I focus on market shares here. First of all, the previous pattern is confirmed. As I said, these are only Chinese observations, so observations on Chinese banks lending as a dependent variable. We see this trade becomes insignificant. The correlation patterns with FDI turn more pronounced in the post-COVID period. Portfolio investment is still negative, as I said, could be because of capital controls. But then if we turn now to the other borrower characteristics, they also confirm our previous findings. In the lower part, which is also highlighted in blue, you can see these policy initiatives, and this is what's new, it's regression, namely that we find a very strong and positive effect of the Belt and Road Initiative, but basically there is no significant effect in the post-COVID period for swap lines. There are different swap line indicators. The one we use here is really like whether or not a swap line was used by a borrower country. But apparently there's no significant effect. 2
minutes left.
Great. In a different set of regressions, we also looked at sanctions. And there, the evidence that we find is really not conclusive. So actually we turned away from this. We focus on, in terms of policies, we looked at the BRI and swap lines. And on the next slide, I think we also look at, that's the right one, thanks. We also looked at indicators of geoeconomic fragmentation. So basically this is just a small part of a bigger table where we interacted trade and FDI, as I said, only for China and Chinese variables, with indicators of geoeconomic fragmentation, like connector countries, and this is exactly what Linder had just produced. So for us, connector countries, they have to fulfill 3 criteria. They have more imports from China, higher exports to the US, and higher FDI from China. And we find that, well, there's not really a significant effect for the connector countries. So maybe that's too early because the data here ends in 2022. It could be that this effect only becomes more pronounced later. The second indicator of geoeconomic fragmentation are these UN-US voting patterns. So voting in the General Assembly, countries which vote similar to the US apparently have more, let's say, are more in this camp of being likely to be exporters. But again, there's no significant, or there's at least no big change as far as that's concerned. So on the last slide, I think we can skip the robustness checks. Just to conclude, in this paper, we look at how Chinese banks lending evolves after the pandemic. Our descriptive evidence suggests that there is a slowing of this expansion, but apparently there is some heterogeneity depending on the borrower country, but overall in aggregate there is a slowdown. We find changing patterns, namely that the correlation patterns are moving away from bank lending and trade towards stronger FDI correlations with bank lending. Apparently, Chinese banks have a different perception of risk. This is the evidence that we saw on the indicators of perceived corruption, for instance, but also there's also some evidence from the indicators on debt, so on the debt burden of countries. As far as foreign policies are concerned, there's a strong effect for BRI countries, but apparently not for swap lines. And there are no significant interactions, or at least no changes with respect to these geoeconomic fragmentation variables. Yeah, so overall, we probably sooner or later we should actually update our analysis because we have to end in 2022. New data is available, so it could change, but at least this pattern away from trade towards FDI correlation seems to be very persistent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the nice presentation. Is there any question? Yes, one in the chat. How do lending conditions by Chinese banks compare to those by other foreign lenders? Are they more favorable or comparatively expensive? To what extent is this driven by the different perception of risk you mentioned? Or does China have a longer-term strategic perspective and criteria?
This is a very good question. And for the first part of the question, actually, I have to point you to the work by Christoph Drebesch. Unfortunately, we don't have the prices, so we cannot look at the individual conditions, but they did. And apparently, the conditions the conditions underlying Chinese banks lending are very strong. So they demand high prices and they demand very high collateral. Unfortunately, this is not in our data, but based on their evidence, this is what they find. As I said, it's complementary because they only have some part of the data that we have, or they only capture a very isolated part of the lending in total. But yes, you could actually build this bridge and imagine that the higher prices are also due to, let's say, higher risk premia, because as you saw, if the sovereign rating is worse and if you have higher debt, then it's reasonable to assume that also means that Chinese banks demand higher prices.
Okay. Okay, is there any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I might just ask, so in general, no, this shift that you document in the paper from trade-driven to FDI-driven lending, what are the implications for the influence that China may have on the economic policies of these countries and also on their strategic alignment in the current context?
Another good question. It seems like also from, let's say, newspaper knowledge, and if we connect the different dots here, that lending is part of a package. So our effect was more pronounced for BRI countries, and if you read there are pieces in the Financial Times, for instance, where you can read that there are these packages where China in BRI countries, they have investments, they have infrastructure projects which are funded by bank lending, but there's also some kind of FDI, and then there are conditions, and it's as I said, it's a whole package, which means that, well, probably that is related to some policy objectives under the BRI program. So as far as that's concerned, it seems to suggest that for some countries, these effects can be very strong, but our data does not say. I mean, we just have the bank lending. We could look at other data sets and connect the dots in terms of what are the motivations or what what are the driving factors, let's say, for giving this kind of lending.
Okay, so very good. No, it was very, I mean, indeed, this is an area that deserves further research, and we will also probably start seeing more evidence along the way. I mean, then I wanted to ask specifically on China, but on India, on the role with India, but I think we are just on time, so maybe for a later discussion. So thanks a lot, Kathleen. Now we move to the third paper of the session. Is Tuuli McCully from the Bank of Canada. It's a paper on Chinese with Chinese characteristics and economics versus politics. So maybe we will learn a bit more in the section. Thanks a lot, Tuuli. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
And
okay, let
15 minutes. I guess we will share the drug. Okay.
Can you see my slide?
Yeah. Maybe not fully, I guess. I think we see the...
Is it now?
Okay, the title. Maybe we can go to the next slide to see if we see it. Yeah, now it's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers, the European Money and Finance Forum, and of course the European Central Bank for inviting me to share this research with you. This is a research project that I conducted together with Eva Kerola and Riikka Nuutilainen from the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies. While I'm nowadays at the Bank of Canada, I have to say that most of this work was done while I was in my prior role at the Bank of Finland. So our title is A Trade with Chinese Characteristics, Economics versus Politics. And we study if political or geopolitical issues partially explain China's import decisions in addition to typical business reasons. So here is a quick run through of my presentation. I'll start by explaining what motivated our research. Then we'll take a quick look at the research field. After that, I'll explain our approach. And finally, we discuss our main results. So there are two strands of motivation for our paper. The first relates to trade and China's significance in global trade developments. Since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China has become an incredibly large trading nation. It is truly one of the most important export destinations for basically most countries globally. So therefore, it is important to understand the drivers of Chinese imports, sort of why some countries export more to China than the others. And then a second strand of motivation comes from politics or geopolitics, to be more precise. China operates a very different economic system than Western countries, given that it has this so-called socialist market economy. It's also quite clear that China wants to increase its political power globally and has made significant headways in the global south, for example. So these factors have raised concerns about China's political motivations, as it arguably wants to provide an alternative to the Western value system. So against this background, we want to ask, does China have certain political or geopolitical goals when it does business with other countries? We want to look at factors behind Chinese import decisions to understand if China rewards its trading partners based on their political friendliness with China, or if it punishes its partners who have reservations toward China. So here is a chart that I want to show you that implies that there indeed could be more behind Chinese trade than just business reasons. So here we have Chinese imports that are indexed to year 2002. The red line represents imports from countries that vote in a similar way as China in UN General Assemblies. And then the dotted line is the rest of the countries that vote more differently. So imports from countries that have similar voting patterns have clearly grown more than imports from other countries. So this suggests that China might prefer sourcing its goods from like-minded countries. So when we look at the research field more broadly, the gravity model of trade has a very long history. Catherine also used the framework. So basically it borrows from physics in that the force of gravitation are impacted by mass and distance. So the force of gravitation in our situation here is trade flows between two countries. Mass is the size of the trading partners, and then distance is obviously kilometer distance between them. So the size of a trading partner or the level of economic development positively impacts trade, given that larger and more advanced economies trade more. And then distance between the partners adversely affects trade because of higher transaction costs. So in trade literature, the gravity model has been adjusted in many different ways so that the transaction costs, for example, are captured by many other variables than only distance. So here I have a few relevant examples of relevant work for our paper. For example, Yang and Martinez Sarsoso used the gravity model to show that the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement has a positive impact on regional trade. In a more recent paper, Fu and his co-authors show that the Belt and Road Initiative leads to higher trade in the ASEAN region. And then given that we are interested in combining trade with political connections, a relevant paper for us is Fuchs and Gnan, who show that those countries that officially welcome the Dalai Lama for a visit are punished by China buying less from those countries in the year that follows the visit. So in terms of our contribution, there are three aspects that I'd like to highlight. So first, because China's economic structure differs from other leading economies, these generic gravity models of trade that put a lot of important countries together can fail to capture the unique characteristics related to China's political environment. So we want to focus on China alone to present a comprehensive analysis on Chinese trade. The second contribution is that we take a broad approach by capturing Chinese import flows from the majority of countries globally, regardless of the geographic location or participation in trade agreements. So we don't focus only on the ASEAN or some other aspect, but take basically all flows that data exists. And then the third contribution is that we combine two strands of literature of gravity models so that we have both economic and political.
We don't hear you.
Tuuli, yeah, we cannot hear you. Tuuli, we cannot hear you. I'm not sure.
Not here.
184 countries,
Okay.
plus China. And then our sample period covers years from 2002 to 2022. And we also divide this into two sub-periods, namely from 2002 to 2012. So that is time before President Xi Jinping. And then we look at another period from 2013 onwards to see if things are different under President Xi's leadership. Our dependent variable is Chinese goods imports from a country. We have annual data. And then we study a bunch of variables. And here I have the most interesting ones. First, we naturally include some traditional gravity model variables. We have nominal GDP to capture the size of the economy. We have real GDP per capita to capture the economy's level of development. We also have the physical distance between the capitals of these trading partners. Then our main trade-related variables are import tariffs. So those are weighted average import tariff rates imposed by China on the trading partner. We have a trade agreement variable, which is a dummy variable, so taking a value of 1 if there's a trade agreement between the exporting country and China. And then things get a little bit more interesting here. So our politically inclined variables are here in the table on the right. So let's start from the Belt and Road Initiative. So the membership of the BRI initiative is not available. The Chinese government does not provide this. So we have a couple of options how we capture the participation in the BRI. We have a pro-diversion, so which is a country is considered a member of the BRI if it signs a memorandum of understanding with China. Then we have another version that looks at countries that actually have received large overseas investments from China under the BRI initiative. Then we have the United Nations voting variable. Here we use the ideal point estimates in the UN General Assemblies. And these are the ideal point estimates reflect countries' positions towards the US-led liberal order. And basically, the variable is an absolute distance between each country's ideal point from the ideal point of China. And then we have a Taiwan dummy variable, so that looks at if country has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And then the NATO variable works the same way, so dummy gets the value of 1 if the exporting country is part of the NATO. Then in our specification, we also have fixed effects to take into account other factors affecting
you have
trade.
5 minutes.
Okay. So let's look at some of our key results. The coefficients have expected signs. They are highly significant. I have all the technical result tables at the end of my presentation, so you will be able to drill deeper into them later if you wish. As for the traditional gravity model variables, there are no surprises there. So China imports more from larger and more developed economies. Also, China is more inclined to import from countries that are geographically close by. As for the trade-related variables, tariffs affect trade negatively, so no surprises there either. And trade agreements have a positive impact on Chinese imports. And in terms of the magnitude here, the marginal effect, so if a country signs a regional trade agreement or any sort of a trade agreement with China, it would increase its exports to China by about 115%. So then let's move on to the best part of our project. So that's the politically inclined variables. So in terms of the key results here, let's start from the UN voting. So if a country votes differently from China in the UN General Assemblies, China will import less from that country. So in terms of the magnitude, if a source country moves 1 standard deviation closer to China politically in these votings, China will import 12% more from that country. Then having diplomatic ties with Taiwan has a negative impact on a country's exports to China. So basically, China imports around 70% less from a country that has diplomatic relations with Taiwan compared to countries that have no ties with Taiwan. And interestingly, the coefficients are larger from 2013 onwards. So then China imported on average 80% less from countries with official diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So it seems that this Taiwan issue has become more important under Xi Jinping. Then in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, well, it was created in 2013. So it is not a surprise that the variable becomes significant in the latter sub-period. In terms of the magnitude, if you look at the proto definition, so signing a memorandum of understanding, a source country could export on average 31% more to China relative to other countries. But this result is significant only at the 10% level. Interestingly, though, it seems that the level of commitment matters quite a bit here. So once a country receives an investment from China under the BRI umbrella, then the results are more significant now at the 5% level. And China imports on average 37% more from those countries that have received BRI investments. And then finally, we have the NATO variable. So it seems that China tends to import less from the NATO countries. So there might be this East-West division thing going on here. So the marginal effect shows that being a NATO member results in a 48% lower exports to China. And then we also wanted to test this out a little bit. So if we swapped a NATO membership by a regional dummy, we saw that China actually imports less from countries that are either in North America or in Europe compared to Asia. So to conclude, our results show that business is not the only consideration for China when it buys goods from abroad. It seems to use trade as a tool to reward countries if they are friendly with China, or punish countries if they have a sort of reservations towards Chinese way of doing business. That is all I have, and I welcome any questions and comments.
Thanks a lot, Tuuli, for being almost perfectly in time. So we have here already in the chat a question from Ernest, which I can read. So China has been using a carrot and stick approach to trade for a while. To what extent is this different from the recently observed weaponizing trade? Is the difference just one of degree? What instruments does China use beside import duties, quotas, informal guidance of Chinese importers? And what kind of measures do China trade agreements typically include? Are there any estimates of the negative welfare costs also from China, from countries' carrot and stick trade policy? So it's a lot of questions in one.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I'll do my best to cover at least some aspects of that. You're absolutely right that this is nothing new. So it seems that China has been pursuing this way of influencing or being selective in its trading partners for quite a while. It does seem that things have become more, or this kind of geopolitical reasons have become more important lately since President Xi Jinping has been in power. And I guess that goes nicely hand in hand with this more geo-economic fragmentation and sort of trade and policy uncertainties that we are experiencing right now. In terms of the policy toolkit, I think the question already answered most of it. So there are a lot of ways, whether they are tariffs or just basically one big thing that, and it's hard to study, but is this guidance by the central government. So even private firms in China have to have this political cell or unit in the firms that sort of is a filter and gives guidance from the central leadership to the company, and therefore even if companies are not forced to do something, they typically listen because they want to make sure that they receive on the good side of the spectrum. That nobody wants to have a conflict with the government. So I would highlight that as a new emerging way of how China is influencing the private sector in particular. Public side, state-owned enterprises, then it's a lot easier to directly influence what they need to do or what kind of clients or partners they have to choose. But the private side, of course, is quite a more trickier.
Okay, thanks. We have another question from François Desoir. So did you also look at Chinese exports to see what patterns can be uncovered there? It seems that Chinese imports and export strategies are very different.
Yes, that's a very good point. We only focused on imports in this research because the industrial policies are very different. It's a totally different toolkit. China has export subsidies and also support measures that are not easily observed. So we decided to only focus on imports in this paper, but naturally your question is 100% valid there, and this is something that we will be looking into in future research.
Okay, we have another question from Max Paleschke. How do you define political relations to Taiwan? Bucket is 1-0, depending on the official accepting Taiwan as a country definition, or is the strategic ambiguity of most countries taken into account?
Mm-hmm. So we discussed this at length, and we decided to only look at the official diplomatic relations. So only if a country recognizes Taiwan as a sovereign state, then that's considered as relations with Taiwan. You can certainly define that in many different ways. And actually in a other paper that we are still working on, we are looking at different definitions, seeing how there can be many different levels of the level of relations with Taiwan. So that's a very, very good questions. But this was simply political, official diplomatic relations.
Okay, and one more question from our keynote speaker. Fascinating paper. Any data on whether China favors countries that adopt its digital technology standards? Some reports that many BRI countries have done so, but it's not clear whether that's just a condition of investment.
That's a very good question, and I will take note of that because it's important to look into that. It goes beyond the scope of our paper, but I certainly have heard about the same thing, that China, maybe it's part of this China's long-term strategy to promote this multipolar world, that it would like to reward countries that adopts its technology standards, sort of create that foundation for increasing China's own geopolitical might globally. But we don't have data for this, but definitely interesting to look into in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so very good. Thanks a lot, and see you later.
After what I found a very, very good first session, now we get to a session that explores a bit more in detail how China doesn't only adapt to, but also really shapes the current wave of trade realignment, right? And it does so in an environment that we've also discussed in parts already, namely one of higher tariffs and a much more severe geopolitical fragmentation than we had a few years back. So we have 3 papers. The 3 papers examine, in my view, very different but complementary aspects of this process. So we'll see an analysis of the broad structural shifts in trade patterns, right? This is the first paper. Then we'll look at the impact of the tariff trade shock, so mainly the 2025 year's tariffs. and then into the spillovers of the US and China tensions into Europe, which I find particularly interesting. In my view, one key theme that emerges from these three studies is that China is reconfiguring trade with direct consequences for Europe, so for us, and that is maybe an interesting policy implication that we can discuss. So the very last paper also then dives into the carbon border adjustment mechanism, anti-coercion measures, and the like. So in broad, it asks, what should we as Europe do about this? We'll begin with the first paper. Evolving trade systems, China as a high-tech competitor, and then we'll go into the rest.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, for the introduction, and thanks for the ECB and SUERF for organizing this very interesting event. So this is indeed largely based on the work that was presented at Sintra already a couple of months ago. So this is joint work with Florencia Airodo, Alexandre Gaillard, and Ana Maria Santa Creu. And let me start with the usual yet very important disclaimer. So the view expressed in this discussion are my own and do not represent the view of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, where Ana Maria is located, nor the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, where I'm located, nor any other person really associated with the Federal Reserve System. So really the views are our own. And with that said, let me jump to it. So the premise of the paper is really the fact that we want to document the change in the trade landscape that has been happening over the past decade. And over the past decade, really, so in the past, trade was mostly driven by efficiency, and by and large, countries were sourcing inputs and imports where it was the most efficient and cost efficient given quality to do so. And with the rise in geopolitical distance, as well as new industrial strategies developed all around the world, and particularly in China, the drivers of trade kind of shifted. And it's not only about efficiency anymore, and it's about resilience. It's about being well positioned for the future. And so what we want to do in this paper is really to bring to the table like new indices, new metrics, and document those new trends, and then see and discuss how they shape the challenges that advanced economies are going to face in the coming decade, and with a particular focus on Europe, given that this is an ECB and SUERF event. And you know, we thought this was appropriate. So the three trends we want to document with new metric and really quantify things are the following. So the first, it's about rising competition from China, and here we want to document the impressive shift that China has been undergoing over the past decade, from going from a supplier of cheap goods in some sense to really an innovation-driven head-to-head competitor for advanced economies, and in particular for Europe. And the shift in the sectoral repositioning of China has been extremely impressive, and now it's high time we take stock of it and try and document and quantify it in a good way. The second trend is about geopolitical fragmentation, which is kind of some sort of a buzzword in those days, and there's a lot of paper about it. And what we want to do here is kind of go look under the hood and try to bring a kind of a granular view of fragmentation and show that geopolitical fragmentation in the trade landscape is happening, but it's happening actually asymmetrically and in a very selective way in terms of sectors and country pairs. And really China plays a big role here in shaping geopolitical fragmentation dynamics. And the third trend is about the concentration of supply chain. And so you will see actually one chart that Linda actually already showed in the keynote presentation, which is how China dominates the extraction and the processing of critical minerals. And we'll have some things to say as well about that. So let me jump to the first trend, which is really trying to get a sense of the impressive shift in the sectoral composition of Chinese export and Chinese innovation. So the first thing I want to look at is innovation. And so we are going to look at cross-border patenting. This is data from my friends Ana Maria and her co-authors. And so we are looking at patent exports. So what are those? Patent exports, it's a situation where a firm located in one country files for a patent in another country. And past research has shown that patent exports, so so-called exports, are very interesting to look at because they are revealing firms actually trade strategies, and firms tend to actually license patents in markets they want to break into or they want to expand into so that they can protect their innovation in valuable foreign markets. And so what we do is we look at the sectoral composition of patent exports from all countries in the world, and we develop this new measure of similarity in the sectoral composition of patent exports. And so we call that the patent similarity index. It's an index that is equal to 0 when two countries really innovate in completely different sectors. There's no overlap. And it's equal to 100 if two countries exactly innovate in the same sectors. And what we are trying to do is we're going to track over time the evolution of the similarity between Chinese innovation strategy and patent exports and other advanced economies or advanced economies patent exports. And what you have in the chart on the left is really this time evolution. And to me, the most interesting thing would be the red line, so for Germany. And you can see that for Germany, the degree of similarity between Chinese patent export strategy, so innovation, and German innovation strategy increased a lot from about, say, 66% to close to 80% of similarity. And this shift is very impressive. And when you look under the hood, it's really driven by Chinese repositioning itself in the sectors where Germany, the Euro area, and the US were already active in. So it's really about Chinese changing the sectoral composition of its own innovation. And when you look at the sectors that are driving this increased similarity between Chinese innovation and other advanced economies innovation, it's really driven by machinery and transport equipment, as well as some of the chemical and advanced chemical processing activity. So that's about innovation, and it tells us something about China not being a country that actually is catching up with the technological frontier and is trying to replicate existing strategy, but China increasingly is innovating in the sectors that advanced economies are innovating in. Now, a related side or facet of this issue of China repositioning itself is, of course, to look at actual trade flows. And here we are creating something, a new tool to think about trade developments more broadly. It's a new index which we call the Partner Similarity Index, and it's a measure of export-import sectoral overlap. So it's an index based on the sectoral composition of a country's exports and another country's imports. And we are trying to see what is the overlap, the sectoral overlap between an exporter's specialization when it exports to the whole world and an importer needs when it imports from the whole world. And we are tracking this overlap over time. So let me get to it a bit more precisely. When you look at the chart on the left, the solid line captures the similarity between Chinese exports and Euro area imports. And you see that over the past decade, China has been increasingly repositioning itself to be very aligned in terms of its exports, aligned with what the Euro area actually needs. And so China is positioning itself in a way to penetrate the EU and the US and many advanced economies actually markets. And so China changed the sectoral composition of its exports to be now extremely impactful when it wants to reach advanced economies. Now, on the other side, let's look at the similarity between Euro area exports to the world and whatever China is importing. So that's the dashed line on the left chart. And you see a decrease there. So you see that China is increasingly dissimilar in terms of its import demand, dissimilar compared to what the Euro area is exporting to the world. And you see really this asymmetry where China is positioning itself in a way to better serve advanced economies, while at the same time positioning its imports in a way to be less dependent from advanced economies. And I think in a sense that also talks to the paper that Tuuli presented a bit earlier today, which is China is having an import strategy that is really geared towards emerging markets that are geopolitically aligned and also part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we see that in the change in the sectoral composition, actually, of Chinese imports. And it resonates with this big push that started in 2016 of China, which they call self-reliance. And China really tries to replace actually its import from advanced economies with domestic production. And to me, what's interesting is really this impressive and unprecedented sectoral repositioning in China in a very asymmetric way, so that China is well positioned to serve advanced economies, but also well positioned to not need advanced economies for its imports. So let's move to the second trend I want to talk about, which is geopolitical fragmentation, as it has been discussed a lot in the past, but also bringing to bear and bringing to the table some kind of granular view of what's happening for some key country pairs and key sectors. So what do we do here? So we are using a very standard gravity estimation model along the line, in a sense, with what Tuuli actually also presented. And so we are doing a rolling window analysis. In the charts you see, the blue dot is the estimated association between geopolitical distance and trade, and the bars are just the uncertainty around the estimate. So on the left chart, what you have is the estimation of the role of how geopolitical distance is actually a drag on trade when using all countries. And you see the negative value towards the end of the sample, means that, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we see geopolitical distance being an important and statistically significant driver of trade flows, in the sense that geopolitically distant partners are actually having a lower growth rate of trade compared to geopolitically aligned partners. And so that resonates with, say, some of the papers by Gopinath and Gurachas in the JIE. And there's a lot of papers that talk about that. Now, what happens to this very estimate when I'm removing China from the sample? And that's what you have for the chart on the right. And you see that when you're removing China from the sample, you see that geopolitical distance has a bigger impact on trade, and also the impact starts earlier. And what I'm taking from comparing the left and the right charts is really the fact that for the world as a whole, geopolitical alignment, increasingly over the past 5 to 10 years, has been playing a role in shaping trade flows. But China, when you include China in the sample, in the picture, and China is actually not really fitting well this pattern, because including China muddies the estimation. And it's really a testament to the fact that China has been increasing their exports to advanced economies, to a lot of advanced economies but the US. And so China is not in many ways is not fitting the pattern of disconnecting itself from geopolitically distant partners, because it increases penetration to geopolitically distant partners in terms of exports. Now it's also, of course, reducing its reliance in terms of import from geopolitically distant partners. And to me, what it says is that this whole debate about geopolitical fragmentation, as it has been modeled and simulated, say in the IMF World Economic Outlook a year ago, and I think the BIS and ECB also has done work on that. Usually, it's the way it's modeled is as a uniform and one-size-fits-all, in a sense, reallocation of trade flows, where trade flows are happening more within blocks and less across blocks. But just looking at the export from China to Europe, or export of China to the UK, or export of China to Australia, export of China to Canada, you see that this is not happening when it comes to China's exports. And so having in mind this asymmetry in Chinese import and export strategy, to me it's an important way of thinking about the details of geopolitical fragmentation. And I want to emphasize that geopolitical fragmentation is also selective in a very specific sense, which is the sectoral dimension. So what do we do in this slide? We're looking at the change in import shares between 2017 and 2023. And we are showing the top 3, those who gain import share in Europe for the top row and in the US for the bottom row. And so the top 3 as well as the bottom 3. And I think it's interesting to start with the 2 charts on the left. Those are change in import shares between 2017 and 2023 for Europe up top and for the US at the bottom. And you see that China, the red bar, is actually having not the same kind of trajectory. For the US, you see that the import share from China since 2017 has been decreasing a lot. And there's a clear decoupling between the US and China. And that indeed is true for both the import and the export side. Now, looking at Europe up top, you see that over those 2017-2023 years, over this period, China increased penetration in Europe. You also see actually that both Europe and the US completely decoupled from Russia, or not really completely, and we know there's some issues with gas and oil trade, but largely decoupled with Russia. But China actually has a different kind of fate and dynamics when you're comparing Europe and the US. Now, let's see, like, under the hood, what's happening with European imports from China at the sectoral level. And what you see here is that over this period, China has been penetrating a lot the European markets in terms of high-tech goods, and that's the positive red bar you have up top in the middle, while at the same time, China has been reducing its export penetration in Europe for low-tech goods. And again, to me, this is important because we are talking about some of the key sectors that will be important for the green transition or the digital transition. And we see that in those sectors that are really useful for the future in terms of economic and growth model in the coming decade, China is actually increasing its presence in Europe, and that doesn't fit the narrative of geopolitical fragmentation that we see in some of the reports out there. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we think about fragmentation. Now, related to the first 2 points I talked about, the trade similarity, the innovation, as well as the selective and asymmetric fragmentation. The third trend I want to document is the high dependency of both Europe and the US on a few import partners for key advanced technology products. So what do we do in this slide? We are looking at an index of concentration, the Herfindahl index, so it's pretty standard in the literature, the HHI. It's an index that's, broadly speaking, it takes high value when imports are highly concentrated among a few countries that are supplying those goods. And a value above 0.25 is already considered to be a relatively high concentration, and above 0.5 it's really a very high concentration of your imports in terms of partners. And while the numbers differ between the euro area and the US, what you see in this chart, when I'm comparing the US for the vertical axis and the euro area for the horizontal axis, you see that in both cases, you see a very high concentration of imports for some of the key technologies that are important going forward. And I'm talking about the part of nuclear reactor and, of course, solar cells in Europe, units for ADP machine. ADP is for advanced data processing. So those are key for artificial intelligence and data center. And you see that for the supply of those goods, both the euro area and the US are highly concentrated in terms of partners. And what we show actually in the paper that we presented at Sintra is that when you look at who are the few suppliers that are important for those goods, by and large, they are geopolitically distant suppliers, which raises the risk and the vulnerability of EU area and the US in terms of being cut off from key suppliers. Now, related to the risk and the vulnerability associated with being dependent on a few partners. This is a chart that actually Linda presented in her keynote speech earlier today. And it's a chart that we put together for our Sintra presentation. And we are taking just plain vanilla and publicly available international agency, energy agency data. And we are putting the world market share of a few countries in terms of the extraction and processing of critical minerals, so rare earth as well as lithium, cobalt, and copper. And what you see here is that either China has a very high share in extraction, and that's the case for rare earth, or actually, even when it does not have a big world market share in terms of extraction, it does have an almost monopolistic share in the processing of those key and critical elements that are very important for green transition and some of the digital transition going forward. And so really what we want to emphasize in our analysis and discussion is really that the change in China sectoral composition and the change in China import and export strategy gives rise for Europe and for a few other advanced economies to two separate but still interconnected risks. The first risk, it's about the China shock, it will be a China shock 2.0, of course, and it's the fact that China is increasingly competing in sectors that were traditionally the strength of advanced economies. And China is repositioning towards head-to-head competition in both production and innovation in some of those key sectors. And here the risk is one of substitution of domestic workers in advanced economies in favor of Chinese workers. It could be efficient from a cost perspective, but we need to think about the impact on jobs and national sovereignty going forward. At the same time, China is also dominating sectors that advanced economies never entered. Those are critical minerals, rare earth, lithium, cobalt, and copper. And this is the risk. It's about being cut off from key supplies. That's exactly the paper that Harald talked about earlier today. And so the weaponization of those critical minerals could create some pretty devastating costs in downstream industries. And so now, in the face of those two risks that we can now actually document, look at the details, and have new metrics to think about, what could be a possible response for Europe. And here we are going to talk about something that has been in the public discussion for, it's hardly new, for a few decades actually, but we want to say again, re-emphasize again, why is it that now is again the time, it's a call for action, the time to think about deeper internal integration for Europe, both in terms of goods markets and in terms of capital markets. So let me maybe, just for the sake of it, state again the argument, just to make sure that it percolates everywhere. So why is it important to have an integrated and deep good and capital market in Europe? One is about market size. So we know that both because in some sectors you have economies of scale, but also because of having a large home market incentivizes innovation. That's the whole home market effect that Agion and Zingales and even Krugman have been talking about. Having a good, large and integrated goods market is what you need to have scale, to have efficiency, and to have innovation and the right incentive for innovation. I would note that in the very nice presentation that Harald was doing this morning, he showed that in the face of being cut off from key supplies, some advanced economies back in 2010s have been reacting by innovating. It's a good way out. But the incentive to innovate would be even larger in the case of a deep and large internal market. And we saw in Harald's slide this morning that although innovation is a way out, it did not fully compensate the cost. There was still some negative GDP and welfare costs associated with being cut off from Chinese rare earth and critical mineral. On the other hand, having a deep and good capital market could create the incentive for more innovation and being more resilient in Europe. Capital Markets Union, same argument in a sense. It's about creating the so-called savings and investment union. Having a deep capital market would enable an improvement of capital allocation in Europe. We know that capital allocation in Europe is very particular compared to the US. There's not a lot of high-risk financing. Scale up for startups is extremely hard, and those actually tend to go to the US to raise a lot of money for risky activities. So having an integrated capital market and moving from a fragmented small pocket of funds into a big market might help actually have a better and more risk-prone allocation of capital. The whole idea is to revive risk appetite for startups, for innovation in Europe, and that can happen through both goods and capital markets. So what we do in the paper now, in terms of measuring the progress that has been made regarding European integration, we do something that is not new as well. It's just new data and a bit of new method. But basically, we are looking at a gravity estimate, and we have some dummy for within EU trade and also extra EU trade. And from that, we are backing out an equivalent of tariffs. So those are not tariffs; those are tariff equivalents, cost of doing trade. And we are tracking the evolution of this tariff equivalence barrier over time for internal euro area barrier as well as external euro area barriers. And so for the sake of time, let me look at just the blue line. The blue line reflects, shows the evolution of internal trade barriers in the euro area. And what you see is that good news, at least, it's below the black and the red line. So it's easier to do trade within Europe than outside of Europe. fair enough. But you also see that those barriers are still quite significant. And you also see in terms of the time dynamics that integration actually stalled in the mid-2010s. And we have actually in the paper some discussion about what could be the driver of this increase, a quite surprising increase in the internal trade barriers in Europe. And that could be linked, it's a bit tentative, so it's hard to do a clean analytical empirical work, but it could be linked to the increase in industrial policy and some of the regulatory divergences, some of new standards that have been applied that are country-specific instead of being sometimes Europe as a whole. And so some governments are playing the card of their own country, privileging their own country and not Europe, and that's more conducive to reducing euro area integration. And so to us, that's something that should be addressed, especially so in face of the big changes in the trade landscape that we've been documenting. So let me try and finish there. So really, I want to re-emphasize that the goal of this discussion and this paper is to try and put some actual metric and trends on some of the stuff that has been discussed in policy circles for quite some time, but were not precisely measured. One is the very impressive sectoral reallocation of the Chinese economy. And you see that for innovation, you see that for trade, and you see this asymmetry between Chinese exports penetrating foreign markets, advanced economies markets, and Chinese imports cutting off from advanced economies markets. You see this selective fragmentation, selective in the sense that, again, Chinese exports do not fit the picture, and that should be recognized. And also the fact that at the sectoral level, it's very easy to disconnect and to decouple from China in terms of low-tech goods, because you have other alternative suppliers. For high-tech goods, it's much harder, and Europe has not been very active in trying to develop alternative source of high-tech suppliers in the last decade. And the third is about strategic dependency, in particular for critical mineral and rare earth. And we think that those trends create a risk for growth, inflation, as well as for the effectiveness of monetary policy in Europe, because different countries are exposed differently to those trends. And so in response to those shocks and those trends, it's very important to think about policies to actually improve reliance and think very hard about innovation in Europe as a way to come out of this crisis from the top. And I'm going to stop here.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Francois. This was super interesting. So we went a bit over time, but I thought it was worth it because that was not only very interesting results, but also I think very policy relevant. So I opened the floor. I put one little question in the chat, but that we don't have to start with that. Roman, do I assume correctly that you want to ask a question?
Yes. So I wanted to ask a question about like this finding that China now is competing more with Europe. Can you let us know like exactly in which sectors they are competing more, and if there is also competition like from the import market or just like exports around the world?
So good point. So we have in the paper the very fine, and we have actually a publicly available data set for everyone to use that breaks down this increase in similarity between Chinese exports and European imports, and the breakdown by sector. So how much each sector contributes to this increase in similarity. And by and large, it's about automotive cars, you know, solar panel. Solar panel it's actually done now. But so on the top of my head, I will need to look at the precise sectors, but by and large, it's machinery and transport equipment. Now, what you're hinting to, I think, in your question is also very interesting and important, which is how about the effect on third markets? So I've been talking about the head-to-head competition between China and Europe and how China is competing with Europe on their own turf, while at the same time cutting off from Europe on the Chinese turf. Now, how about third markets? And for that, we actually are creating something called the Export Similarity Index, and we track how much Chinese exports to the rest of the world actually more and more resembles European exports to the rest of the world. And so China is not only competing with Europe on their own turf in Europe, they are also competing with Europe on third markets. And that makes it so that having an export-led strategy for growth, which is typically, say, the case of Germany, a growth model based on cheap gas from Russia and a lot of export to China, So not a best model right now. And so you see China repositioning itself, both cutting off export and competing with Germany in a bunch of markets is actually a very important trend going forward.
Thank you.
Very good. Let's say for now, we move on with our second paper, and this is the 2025 trade war.
Thank you very much to the organizers, to the European Central Bank, and to the Forum of Economic and of Money and Finance. So I'm going to present this paper about the dynamic impacts of the 25 trade war across US states and the global economy. This is joint work with Andres Rodriguez-Clare, who is at Berkeley, Mauricio Ulate, who is at the San Francisco Fed, Jose Vasquez at LSE, and me. And the standard message applies. So like these views expressed in this paper do not reflect the views of the Federal Reserve System and the San Francisco Fed Board. The idea of this paper is to simulate what is going to be the impact of the 2025 trade war imposed by the US. So we used to live in a world in which tariffs were ruled by the WTO. But since 2019 and 2018, when with the first trade war, like some of these things have been changing. And it is important to understand what is going to be the economic impact of these tariff increases on local labor markets across US states, but also across the world. So to do that, we're going to rely on a model that we have developed with my co-authors, in which there are going to be forward-looking agents. These agents are going to face moving costs to relocate across different sectors. And we're going to embed that framework into a quantitative trade model in which there is going to be home production, as in the traditional model of Caliendo, Orkin, and Parro, which I think that Harald also used in his presentation today. Now, the main element that our model is going to have, like the new ingredient that the model is going to have, is that we're going to have involuntary unemployment, because there are going to be downward nominal wage rigidities that in some cases are going to prevent that the labor supply equalizes the labor demand. So this is going to generate first endogenous labor force participation, because you have this home production sector, and second, there is going to be unemployment, so we can analyze what is the impact of the trade war on different outcomes, including the involuntary unemployment measure. Now, we're going to implement some changes relative to the baseline model that we used. So in particular, we're going to assume that there is no migration across different US states. And the reason for this is just for simplicity. And because in our framework, when we are calculating like the gains from these tariff increases, like the tariff revenue is going to be very important, we're going to assume that the tariff revenue is going to be rebated to the US states based on population. So larger states are going to get a larger share of that tariff revenue. Like in the model, we're going to solve it with perfect foresight, but the surprise is going to be the rise in the tariffs in 2025. But afterward, they are going to have perfect foresight that tariffs do not change, and they are going to revert like 4 or 8 years later. So what is the data that we're going to use to calibrate the model? So we're basically going to update the data set that we have been using for previous papers. In particular, we're going to consider 87 regions. This is going to include the 50 US states plus or 36 countries, including the European Union and China. We're going to include 15 sectors. This includes like a home production sectors, 12 manufacturing sector, plus a service sector and agricultural sector. And then we're going to use data from 2019 for our simulations. So like the tariff data, we're going to use like the data from Fiora Tetti. So there are some issues that she found in the WITS data set from the World Bank. So like some of the tariffs were like badly imputed in that case. So she corrected some of those issues. So we're going to use her data. And then we're going to follow this paper by Liao in the GAI to aggregate the tariffs across 2-digit sectors. For the bilateral trade flows across countries, we're going to use just OECD data. and to construct like the trade flows across US states and between US states and other countries, we're going to use the commodity flow survey. We need data between the US states and other countries, so we're going to complement this data with US census data that provides this information, and then for the state level production and consumption, we're just going to use the data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, plus some proportionality assumptions with gravity equation. And then for the sector bilateral trade migration flows between US states. So in this case, it is very important to consider like not only trade flows, but also migration flows. We are going to use the current population survey data. Okay, so for our simulation, we're going to use the following parameters. So the first one is like the lower bound in the nominal wage rigidity. We're going to use a value of 1. What does this mean? It means that wages cannot go below the previous level. So if, for example, the wage before was 2,000 euros, like the wage cannot decrease by less than those 2,000 euros. Then we need some nominal anchor, so we're going to assume that the growth rate of nominal GDP is 3%. This is just to prevent that at some point the downward nominal wage rigidity is going to be binding. And for the elasticity of moving across sectors, we're going to use this parameter of 0.5, which means that the elasticity to move across sectors is equal to 2. And for the trade elasticity, which is going to be one of our key parameters here because it measures like the market power that some of these countries may have, we're going to use like different values. So the common assumption is 6, but recent literature has found that probably like the value of the trade elasticity is actually lower. So we're also going to use the values from the recent paper by Levchenko and co-authors that finds a lower value in 2 in the long run, but in the short run it's going to be around 1.5. Okay, so the shock right now is the tariffs that the current US administration announced on the Liberation Day, that is April 2nd. So those tariff changes have been I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen with tariffs, but the most recent announcement was in August 2025. We're like simulating those changes, but I'm going to present the result with the previous one. So I'm going to present the results with the ones from April 2nd. So this one included tariffs on Canada and Mexico that they increased to 25%. The tariff on China increased uniformly by 54%. And the other countries' tariff increased according to the schedule from Liberation Day. In our baseline simulation, that tariff increase is going to last for 4 years, and affected countries are going to retaliate with mirror tariffs. But we're going to consider also alternative scenario in which the duration of the shock is 8 years, 12 years, 16 years. And there are also other scenarios of retaliation so that countries do not retaliate, which I think that is the current behavior that most of countries around the world are having, that they only retaliate by 50% or that they retaliate even more by 150%. So these are like the main results that we find for the US economy. So this is just how employment is going to change in the US. So what we can observe is that employment in manufacturing is going to increase by around 2%. And then after the shock reverses, then employment in manufacturing is going to decrease. And the reason for this is because the US is a net importer of manufacturing these days, and tariffs are trying to protect the manufacturing sector. We observe like a decrease in agriculture and services. And at the aggregate level, there is going to be a decrease in labor force participation. And the reason because of this is that home production increases due to the increases in the price index. We observe that there is going to be an increase in real wages for the manufacturing sector, but actually like the people that work at the service sector and agricultural sector are going to experience some losses in real income. And this is coming from the fact that the price index, especially in the manufacturing sector, is increasing. So you can observe here that the price index is going to increase by almost 5%. So in general terms, then when we analyze what is happening to real value added at the aggregate level and for each sector, we see that there is going to be an increase in manufacturing, but the cost is high, in the sense that real value added is actually going to decrease by 2% given the current situation of tariff. So of course, like some people are going to gain with these tariff increases, but overall the US economy, or at least in our baseline simulation, there is going to be a decrease in real value added. Now, we analyze also what is going on with employment, labor participation, and unemployment. So one interesting finding here is what happens to unemployment once the shock is reversed. So in 2028, when the shock is reversed, unless and we suppose that tariffs return to the initial level, what is going to happen is that there is going to be involuntary employment, because wages in the manufacturing sector are going to tend to decrease. And because wages are decreasing, but they are going to hit that downward nominal wage rigidity, that is going to generate this peak in involuntary unemployment. So the consequence here, or at least the message here, is that maybe today we are not going to observe like changes in unemployment in the US economy, but in the future, once like some of these shocks is reversed, it can be the case that unemployment rises because of this downward nominal wage rigidity. And we can observe that in general, there is going to be a large decrease for the US real GDP of almost between 1 and 1.4%. Now, also something that we analyze here is what are the distributional effects of these tariff increases across US states. And again, like the main message here is that there are going to be some states that lose or states that win, but overall the losses are going to be a higher magnitude than the gains. So in this case, like countries that trade a lot with some of the main US partners, let's say Mexico, Canada, and China, are going to lose from this trade war. So in particular, California, Texas, and Michigan are the states that are going to lose more from this trade war, while countries that while states that first maybe have a comparative advantage in manufacturing relative to other states are the ones that are going to gain. So for example, Colorado, North Dakota, Wyoming are states that are actually going to experience some gains. Now, one important thing is that instead of simulating like this complicated model in which there is like input-output linkages, there is trade across countries and across region, we can think like in very simple sufficient statistic that can tell us some ideas on how much the state or the country is going to lose from this trade war. So based on simple first order approximation and like back of the envelope analysis, we can construct this exposure measure. So this exposure measure is just like a shift share instrument. So it's very similar to Bartik shocks and that recent literature that has analyzed the local effects of trade shocks. So here we construct a Bartik shock in which the shares are going to be how much country I or region I is spending on goods from region J in sector S over the total expenditure from that region I. So this is just how much, like in one particular sector, for example, Michigan is spending on goods from Mexico or on goods from China. So that is going to be the shares. And then the shifters are just going to be the percentage change in the tariff. So this is just calculating how much tariffs between country J and region I are changing in period 1 compared to period 0 in sector S. So that is a very simple statistic that we can use, and we can test where this simple measure or this could work as a sufficient statistic for the effects on unemployment, welfare, and other variables. So when we do this,
3 minutes. Please.
Yes, I will finish soon. So when we do this, we find like a very positive correlation between our exposure measure and the change in real income. So we find an exposure like that the correlation is around 80%. So these simple statistics can actually tell us some story about which sectors, which locations are going to get more exposed to the shock. So for example, here, California and Texas are going to be more exposed relative to South Dakota, West Virginia, or North Montana. Now, let me finish, because I know that we're running out of time, with the impact of the trade elasticity. So the trade elasticity is a very important parameter in this kind of trade models, like also for like gravity equation, because it basically measures like first how substitutable are goods across countries, but also they measure like what is the impact of tariffs or trade costs on different trade flows. And as the trade elasticity gets lower, countries are going to have more market power in the sense that they are going to be able to impose higher tariffs. So in this case, we simulate like the tariff increase for different values of the trade elasticity. And we find that if the trade elasticity is very low, as like some of the recent research suggests, actually like imposing tariff for the US can actually lead to aggregate gains in US real GDP. So you can observe here that if the trade elasticity is very low, actually the US real GDP is going to increase by 0.2, 0.5%. So that the main message here is that in this simulation, this parameter matters a lot. So it is very important to rely on good empirical strategy to estimate this trade elasticity parameter, because like the story completely changes if the trade elasticity is very low. We also analyze the impact of the shock duration. Basically, what the shock duration does is that it just amplifies the effects of the shock. So it is going to be, instead of 4 years, the shock amplifies to 16 years, 8 years, depending on the size of the shock. And we also analyze the impact of the retaliation scenarios. Like the story here is not very interesting. It just suggests that if countries retaliate, the US is going to lose more if there is more retaliation or not. Now, in terms of like the country effects results, what we find, and I think that this goes in line with what some of the IMF simulation that the keynote speaker showed in the first presentation, we find that the countries that are major trading partners with the US are going to lose more from this tariff increase, but Mexico and Canada are going to lose more than China, even if the tariff increase is similar. And the reason behind this is that China can actually reallocate more resources toward other countries rather than the US, compared like to Canada and Mexico, given the proximity that Canada and Mexico have with the US. So China is going to lose around like 0.5% in terms of real income, while Canada and Mexico are going to lose between 2 and 3%, which we think that is important. Okay, so to conclude, let me say that there are some caveats with our model. So, for example, we're assuming perfect foresight, but that's not the best assumption of the current situation, because there is a lot of uncertainty. We are running our simulation with very aggregate data, the 2-digit sector level, but many of these effects could be amplified through input-output linkages, or through bank networks. We're holding trade imbalances fixed, and that's the main reason, because the US is increasing tariffs because they want to change the trade balances with other countries. So like there is the question, what if we endogenize in this model trade imbalances? And then we don't know if it is feasible to enforce such a wide range of tariffs across importance. It seems that it is, but I want to highlight these caveats in terms of the interpretation of our results. So thank you, and sorry if I took a little bit more of time than what the program suggested.
No. Very good, Roman. Very good, and very, very nice and rich paper, by the way. I know Massimo has a comment, so let's take 5 minutes for discussion if we wish, and then we move on to the last paper for today. Massimo. Maybe doesn't manage to unmute himself. Very fine. Then we first have, I see this, Massimo. Very good. While you're writing, I think I have a very simple question that I'm not so sure comes out clearly from your estimations. At least for me, it's not clear. In how far can tariff revenues that you create offset the decline in real wages that you see at least across some of the states, right? So in how far can redistribution of welfare help in the US? Yeah.
So that's a great question. So right now, like our measure of real income is including the tariff revenue. So when we say that, for example, the California is losing in terms of real income because of the increase in the tariff, that is including the tariff revenue. Now, there is the question where our assumption about that tariff revenue is redistributed across the states based on population is a good assumption or not. I think that we need to do a better work there. But it could be the case that if we change that assumption and let's say that the US is going to redistribute tariff revenue in terms of like the losses because of the China shock, for example, based on that exposure measure that I told you, it can be the case that some of these effects are going to be reversed in some of these states because it will be a way to compensate the losers, like imposing like kind of a tax to the winners. But so far, our results are just based on this assumption that they are redistributed with population. But it's an excellent point, and it's something that we should work a little bit more.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me now. I think yeah. So my question is the following. So I couldn't help noticing in the map that you put that central states seems to be those who emerge better off from the tariff, and the coastal state, in particular California, is one that emerges, let's say, less well off from the tariff. Yes, and this made me think to an argument that was made by Barry Eichengreen for the first tariff presidency of Trump, comparing tariff at the time, but the argument holds for tariff today, to tariffs during the Gilded period, the Gilded era, so end of the 19th century. And the argument is that tariffs there were expansionary because they were putting a tariff on low productivity sector and moving production away from low productivity sector, to high productivity sector. While here it seems a bit the opposite, no? That you are protecting low productivity sector like agriculture, aluminium production, this kind of stuff, which will be the winners, leading to, let's say, a misallocation of work towards less productive areas. How much of this is into this analysis? So I think here, if I understand correctly what you do, we have constant productivity of labor, no? But to me, I think if I have to think at the very long-term consequences of tariff, this argument about efficient allocation of domestic factor is very, 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 very important.
Okay, okay, that's a great question, and thank you very much for the question. So let me try first. So this is a dynamic model. So we're assuming that productivity is not changing over time. So in some sense, we're basically assuming that the productivity is going to stay at the 2019 level, which is the data, which is the baseline year that we use for our data. Now, saying that, there are going to be differences in productivity across sectors and across regions. So the model is actually capturing that some sectors and some regions are more productive. For example, in like California is more productive, let's say, in producing like high technology relative to other states in the US, such as Colorado or like North Dakota or Wyoming or other states. So in some sense, we're capturing those differences in productivity. And in the end, those differences in productivity are the difference that determine the comparative advantage of these states relative to the rest of the world and the relative to other countries. So because we're capturing those differences in productivities, we're taking into account that when the US imposes higher tariffs, there is going to be reallocation from I wouldn't say that these are like the high productive sectors, but for sure there are going to be reallocation from like the sectors that were like not very much protected in the first, like in 2019, to the sectors that go more protected because of this 2025 trade war. Now, it could be the case, and I agree with you that it probably is the case that they are relocating toward less productive sectors, or at least sectors in which these states do not have a comparative advantage. So in some sense, this is generating some misallocation, and that misallocation translates into these real income losses that at least we simulate. But of course, like it depends on the trade elasticity, it depends on the scenarios that we are using as our baseline.
Thank you. Very good. I think I understand you. I leave you to discuss this further, but otherwise we'll simply not manage with the last presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this good presentation, the good discussion. And we turn towards Francesca.
Hi, everybody, and thanks a lot to the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present our paper. This project is joint work with Irina Balteano and with Maximiliano Moreno, who are my colleagues at the Bank of Spain. It is still a work in progress, so please consider any result as preliminary. So in this paper, we focus on the years of the first Trump administration. In those years, as we know, the US imposed special tariffs on many kinds of products imported from China. In this paper, we study whether the high tariffs in the US market led Chinese exporters to divert some of their exports towards the European market. That is, we ask to what extent, as a result of US tariffs on China, the European market got flooded, so to say, by Chinese products. So why are we interested in this question? Well, the recent US tariff measures, that ones that were imposed earlier this year by the second Trump administration, spurred a debate on their possible effects in terms of trade flow reallocation. And one common concern is that faced with high tariffs on the US front, Chinese exporters could redirect some of their exports towards European countries, thus increasing the competition faced by European producers, while at the same time exerting some downward pressure on EU prices. So in this paper, we look at the most similar episode available in which the US imposed special tariffs on a wide set of products imported from China, which happened precisely during the years of the first Trump administration. The literature has studied widely the impact that US tariffs during Trump's first mandate had on the US, both in terms of trade flows, in terms of prices, and in terms of activity. Now, in terms of trade diversion, the literature has mostly studied whether tariffs on China allowed other countries to increase their exports towards the US market. In this paper, we studied the effect that the tariffs applied to China by the first Trump administration had instead on the EU market, with the objective to investigate if Chinese exports towards the EU increased as a byproduct of US tariffs, and what was the impact on the EU import prices. So in particular, we investigate whether EU imports from China increased due to US tariffs, and in case, which Chinese products were mostly redirected towards the EU market. We ask whether the possible increase in EU imports from China occurred at the expenses of intra-EU trade. And we ask if Chinese exporters decreased their export prices in the EU market in order to relocate their products. From a methodological point of view, we employ monthly bilateral trade flows data and trade unit values data at the country level at a high level of product disaggregation. We use the HS 6-digit level of disaggregation at the product level from this data from TDM. And then we use the tail information on special tariffs imposed on Chinese imports by the first Trump administration from the US Trade Representative. We focus on a panel of countries that includes all EU members between 2017 and 2019. And we study if the imports of these countries from China increased as a consequence of US tariffs by applying diff-in-diff methods. So let me just give you a preview of our main findings. First, we confirm the common result in the literature that US tariffs had a sizable negative impact on US imports from China. On the EU front, we find evidence of limited trade diversion of Chinese exports towards EU countries. In particular, we find that US tariffs increased EU imports from China by less than 4% on average across all affected products. The impact of the US tariffs on EU imports from China was heterogeneous across sectors. We find significant increases in EU imports from China in the sectors of machinery, electronics, metal articles, and optical and precision instruments. However, we do not detect increases in other sectors that were significantly affected by US tariffs, like vehicles, furniture, and plastic. So maybe these products were redirected to some other markets instead. And then we look at the characteristics of the products that were mostly diverted towards the EU market. And we find that more specialized products featured a higher redirection towards the EU, especially in the machinery sector, which we think could perhaps be due to the similarity between the US and the EU as a destination market for specialized products. We find that the increase in EU imports from China occurred at the expenses of intra-EU trade only in one sector among those that were more affected by US tariffs. That is in the optical and precision instrument sector, but not in the other sectors. As for the price impact of US tariffs, we confirm the standard finding in the literature that Chinese exporters did not lower their prices of the affected products in the US market. The novelty is that we find that Chinese exporters did not lower their prices in the EU market either. That is, we don't find evidence that they might have dumped their products in order to place extra units in the European market. So let me start with a very brief description of US tariffs on China that were applied by the first Trump administration. So in this paper, we focus on special tariffs that affected exclusively imports from China. That is, those that were related to Section 301 investigation. Now, the first three waves of Section 301 tariffs, known at List 1, List 2, and List 3, came into effect in mid-2018, 1 month after the other. And then there was a final wave at the end of 2019, known at List 4A, which came into effect in September 2019. Now, in the empirical analysis, we focus only on the waves that are marked in blue in the graph. That is on List 1, List 2, and List 3, and we leave out List 4A, meaning that our sample effectively ends in July 2019, just before List 4A was announced. And this is for two main reasons. First, just 3 months after List 4A went into effect, COVID hit. So the last date that we can safely include in the empirical analysis is December 2019. And this is very close to the implementation date of List 4A. So we think that we cannot compare the impact on List 4A in terms of trade diversion to the other previous lists that had time to deliver their effects in terms of trade diversion before COVID hit. And second, when List 4A was announced, a twin list, List 4B, was also announced, which should have entered into force in December 2019, but never did, due to the trade deal between the US and China. So now the announcement of this additional ghost list, so to say, is a confounding factor that may scramble, we think, identification effects in the last months of 2019. So in the empirical analysis, we focus on tariffs included in List 1, List 2, and List 3 of Section 301, which together covered a relevant share of US imports from China in 2018 and 2019. Tariff rates were not identical across different lists, but most products got applied a 25% tariff. Now, focusing only on these three lists, together these tariff waves affected in particular machinery, electrical and electronical products, miscellaneous manufacturers such as furniture and optical and precision instrument, vehicles, metals, plastic, and chemicals. So the question we address is what was the impact of these tariffs on EU imports from China? And to find out, we rely on definitive methods. So these methods have been used in the literature to study the impact of US tariffs on US imports from China, and also on US imports from other providers. So our empirical specification is based on two of these papers, on the empirical model that are included in two of these papers, which we adapt to our purposes. They're the MBR paper by Dan, Krishna, and Zhao, and the ECB analysis by Chinya, Meiner, Schulte, and Steinhoff. So intuitively, in our case, the definitive consists in computing the increase in EU imports from China for products that were affected by US tariffs, and compares it with the increase in EU imports from China observed in a set of products that were not affected by US tariffs, also controlling for a variety of factors that can affect imports. Now, if EU imports from China of the two groups of products, affected and not affected by tariffs, were growing more or less the same before tariffs were applied, and if we control for enough factors that can influence imports, then the difference in the evolution of EU imports from China across tariffed and non-tariff products is an estimation, everything else equal, of the impact of tariffs on EU imports from China. So in practice, this is implemented through panel regressions. The dependent variables are if imports from China of EU country I of product P, defined at the HS 6-digit level in month T. The treatment, tau, is a dummy variable that gets equal to 1 after the US imposes a tariff on product P imported from China. So the beta coefficient estimates, the beta coefficient estimates the difference in the increase in EU imports from China for tariffed and non-tariff products. That is the percentual increase in EU imports from China due to US tariffs. Now, in estimating this effect, the beta, we have to control for a series of factors that can affect EU imports from China beyond US tariffs. And as it is common in this literature, we do this through a series of fixed effects. So we include important time fixed effects to control for country-specific time-varying factors, such as exchange rate fluctuations or the growth of the importing country. We include imported product fixed effects to account for country-specific tastes or for time-invariant trade policy on a specific product. Importantly, we include sector time fixed effects, where sectors are defined at the HS 2-digit level. So we control for any shock or trend that could have affected a specific HS2 sector, say the electronic sector. And finally, we include water product fixed effects to clean for seasonality because we have monthly data. So in this table, we have the main baseline results. So
Francesca, 5 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, these are the results of the baseline specification. So in column 1, we apply the empirical model to the US, that is to US imports from China. And we replicate the result of the MBR working paper by Daniel and co-authors, but also a standard result in the literature, and find that tariffs had a large negative impact on EU imports from China. Imports from China of affected products dropped by an average 32% for the US. Now in column 2, we apply the empirical model to the panel of EU importer countries, and we find that US tariffs increased EU imports from China by less than 4% on average across all affected products. That is, we find evidence in favor of a limited trade diversion towards the EU market. Now in the last 2 columns, we run placebo regressions, which are a sort of validity checks for the definitive analysis. They consist in running the baseline regression in the pre-tariff period only, with some freight treatment dates. Now, if significant effects are detected also in the pre-tariff period, this is an indication that tariffs and non-tariff products were already growing differently before tariffs kicked in. However, in all cases, placebo regression comes out non-significant in our case, which tends to validate the standard definitive assumptions. Anyways, let me stress that all these results are robust also to relaxing the parallel trend assumption by including a trend that is specific to targeted products. So sectoral heterogeneity. We explore sectoral heterogeneity by running the same regression separately on the HS2 sectors that were more affected by US tariffs. The sectors are identified simply as those with a higher US import value affected. So in this sense, they also had the higher potential for trade diversion. We detect signs of EU-bounded trade diversion in the electrical and electronic sector, in the machinery sector, for iron and steel articles, and for optical and precision instruments. However, for other sectors that were significantly affected by US tariffs, like furniture, vehicles, and plastic, we do not find evidence of trade diversion of Chinese products towards the EU. So, we have found some evidence that US tariffs have increased, although to a limited extent, EU imports from China. So the next question is, which were the characteristics of the products that were redirected towards the EU? To find out, we interact our treatment dummy, the tariff dummy tau, with trade elasticity at the product level, which we take from the database of Fontanier, Gimbod, and Orefice. A higher trade elasticity identifies the products that can be easily substituted across different providers, that is more homogeneous and standardized products. A lower trade elasticity corresponds, on the other hand, to products that are less substitutable, that is to more specialized or customized products. So we find that the lower the elasticity, the more specialized the products, the more they were redirected towards the EU, especially in the machinery sector. So we think that this could be due to the similarity between the US and the EU as a destination market. That is, faced with the decision of where to send specialized products that were placed before in the US market, Chinese exporters could have chosen the EU market as more similar to the US with respect to other destinations. And finally, let me show you some results on the price impact of US tariffs. So using a similar empirical model, we estimate the impact of US tariffs on the price of imports from China of EU importer I or product P at time T. First, when we run this regression, considering the US as the importer, we find the common result in the literature that in response to US tariffs, Chinese exporters did not lower their export prices in the US market. The novelty is that we find that Chinese exporters did not lower their prices in the EU market either. And this result is robust to restricting the estimation to the HS2 sectors that were more affected by US tariffs. So far we haven't found a clear evidence that Chinese exporters dumped their products in order to place them in the EU. So let me just wrap up. In this paper, we studied the impact of US tariffs on European imports from China, finding evidence of limited diversion effects towards EU countries. We find that trade diversion was heterogeneous across sectors, even across the sectors that were more affected by US tariffs. And even within sectors, product characteristics seem to matter for trade diversion, as more specialized products were redirected towards the EU. Also, so far, we haven't found evidence that Chinese exporters might have dumped their products in order to collocate extra units in the EU market. These findings are robust to a series of checks, such as controlling for the exceptions granted to US tariffs at some point, controlling for product level demand shocks, applying different fixed effect structures, and to implementing a triple difference approach. So at the moment, we are working to derive the dynamic impacts of tariffs on EU imports using the estimator of Tuuli, Girardi, Jordan, Taylor, which integrates diff-in-diff and local projection methods and is robust to staggered treatment adoption and to heterogeneity across tariffs waves. So basically, the preliminary findings that we have essentially confirm our main static results of a limited impact on EU imports from China and of a null impact on EU import prices from China. And then we are also expanding the trade flows analysis by investigating the role of comparative advantage. And here the preliminary findings suggest that a stronger comparative advantage of the EU importing country with respect to China does not generally have a meaningful impact on export redirection towards the EU. So in the future, we would also like to study the impact of tariffs on average EU import prices, not only on import prices from China. And we would like to dig deeper into the heterogeneity across sectors, across products, and across EU importer countries, and also to investigate whether the magnitude of the tariffs matters, and possibly to go to the 8-digit level in terms of granularity. And that's it. Thanks.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Francesca. Very, very interesting. Again, very complete. And you managed to stick to the time, so that very good. Now, Francesca, I have the same question before we close in 2 minutes to you as I have to Francois, who, if he wants to, can come in. If in 2 sentences you had to say how Europe should behave in this situation, what we should do about trade, right? What would be your policy recommendation? What would be one policy recommendation to the EU? I'm happy to start with either one of you, Francesca.
Okay. No, I mean it's the question, right? So it's very complex, I think, to give an answer to that. So if you look at it through the eyes of our results, we can say that at least during the first Trump mandate, the impact of US tariffs on EU imports from China was really limited. It was likely higher for some specific sectors, but I mean, to the question flooded from China, the answer of the paper is generally no, there was no flood. So in this, also, it is important to stress that there was quite a lot of heterogeneity across sectors and also at the product level. So any recommendation, I think, should take this heterogeneity into account.
Very good. Thank you. I agree. Francois,
yes,
the internal market, we
exactly.
agree.
Let me just say that, so I agree with most of what has been said. So let me use this opportunity to make one point, which I think is important. There's a big debate about industrial policy, the effectiveness of industrial policy as a tool for governments to induce innovation and align national objective with supply of economic activity. And I think it's great, and the IMF actually has a forthcoming chapter in the next WIO reveal next week, specifically about that, and I think it's great. Now, one point that is sometimes lost in translation is when people look at China as a success story for industrial policy, they're also missing the fact that the share of Chinese firms that are actually making losses has been increasing quite a lot over the past decade. So yes, some sort of industrial policy can give you the right outcome in terms of more exports and more production. Now, is it sustainable? Is it even good for welfare in the long run? It's a bit unclear. And so some industrial policies could work. And I think in the US, there's a lot of debate about it in a nice way, not picking the winners, of course, and also being very forceful in the implementation of industrial policy. But we should not be too naive about what's happening in China either.
Very good, nicely said. Ernst.
This concludes our SUERF ECB workshop on China and the shifting global order. Thank you very much to our speakers, Linda, Harald, Catherine, Tuuli, Francois, Roman, and Francesca, for your excellent presentations. To our co-organizers, Isabel, Alexander, Maria, Taida, Catherine, and Daniel, for the smooth preparation and the excellent moderations. And to all of you, for your interest and your questions and comments. Bye-bye and take care.